Every Pokemon carries something most players never stop to notice, a quiet detail folded into its design, its name, its habitat, or the way it moves when the world grows still around it. The Pokemon series has been accumulating these small truths for decades now, layer upon layer of careful thought pressed into creatures that most people encounter for only a moment before moving on. And before you drift any further, please consider subscribing to join the Cozy Club for more journey like this, and let me know where in the world you are currently watching from tonight. There is something worth understanding about the way Pokemon are named, because the names themselves are rarely arbitrary and almost never as simple as they appear at first glance. Pikachu, the most recognized Pokemon in the world, takes its name from two Japanese words pressed together into something that sounds almost musical. Pika is the Japanese onomatopoeia for the crackling sound of electricity, a bright and sharp little word that captures the feeling of static in the air. Chu is the sound a mouse makes in Japanese, soft and small and perfectly suited to a creature so round and gentle in its proportions. The combination produces something that works in both directions at once, describing what the Pokemon is and what it does in a single breath. It is electric, and it is a mouse, and the name never forgets either of those things. This dual layering of meaning appears throughout the entire Pokédex, not just in the franchise's most famous face. Bulbasaur carries the word bulb in its name, a direct reference to the seed growing on its back that will eventually bloom into something extraordinary. The word sour comes from the Greek for lizard, which was itself borrowed from the tradition of naming dinosaurs in scientific contexts. Bulbasaur is therefore, at its most literal, a bulb lizard, though what actually grows on its back is classified in the Pokédex as a seed rather than a bulb, a small distinction the name quietly overlooks in favor of something that sounds warmer and more approachable. Charmander follows a similar construction, blending the English word char, meaning to burn partially, with salamander, the amphibian long associated in European folklore with fire. Ancient naturalists believed that salamanders could survive flames and even extinguish them, and that mythology passed through centuries of storytelling until it arrived here, embedded in the name of a small orange lizard with a flame burning quietly at the tip of its tail. The flame on Charmander's tail is not merely decorative. The Pokédex describes it as a measure of the creature's life force, burning brightly when the Pokémon is healthy and flickering when it grows weak. This detail transforms a simple visual feature into something far more resonant, a lantern that reveals the inner state of the creature carrying it. When the first Pokemon games were released in Japan in 1996, the development team at Game Freak had been working under considerable constraints for years. Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokemon, had been fascinated since childhood by the act of collecting insects in the rural areas around Tokyo. As the city expanded and the fields where he once hunted beetles and dragonflies disappeared under concrete and development, he held on to the memory of that feeling, the quiet excitement of searching for something hidden and finding it. The Game Boy Link cable became his solution, a way to recreate through technology what urbanization had taken away. Two children could connect their handheld devices and exchange creatures, and in doing so, they could experience something that felt like the natural world, even from the middle of a city. The original two versions, red and green in Japan, were designed around this idea of exchange. Neither version contained every Pokemon. Each held creatures the other lacked, so the only way to complete the collection was to find someone with the other version and trade across the cable. Completion required connection, and connection required another person. This was not a technical limitation that the developers worked around. It was the entire philosophical foundation of the project, built into the structure of the game from the very beginning. The Japanese release of Blue version came several months after Red and Green, and it was originally a special edition distributed through a magazine rather than sold in stores. It used updated graphics and improved sprites compared to the earlier releases, and when Game Freak prepared an international version of the games, they used blue as their visual template while keeping the content structure of red and green. This is why the international red and blue versions look different from the Japanese originals, carrying cleaner and more refined artwork while maintaining the same underlying gameplay. The Western audience received a hybrid product shaped by decisions made months apart across two different release strategies. Gengar has been part of the Pokémon world since the very beginning, standing in shadows and wearing an expression that looks more like satisfaction than menace. Its design is rooted in a specific piece of Japanese folklore surrounding a creature called the Shadow Demon, a being that separates from its owner and develops its own consciousness. The idea that a shadow could become something independent, something with its own desires and its own relationship to the world, is one that runs through many different cultural traditions. Gengar's Pokédex entries across multiple games describe it as the shadow of Clefable, though this relationship has never been confirmed as literal within the games themselves. The visual similarity between the two creatures, their round bodies and wide smiles and stubby limbs, suggests a deliberate pairing, a light and dark mirror of the same basic shape. One lives in sunlit meadows near mountains, and the other drifts through darkness in abandoned buildings and cold corridors. What makes this pairing particularly interesting is the way it frames Gengar not as an inherently threatening creature, but as a complement, a necessary counterpart to something bright and cheerful. The ghost is not the opposite of the fairy. It is its shadow, following it through the world at a careful distance. Gengar is also classified as a shadow Pokémon in the original games in the sense that it can slip through walls and pass through solid objects, emerging from the darkness on the other side unchanged. The Pokédex notes that when the temperature in a room drops suddenly, it may be because a Gengar has passed through the walls nearby, carrying the cold of somewhere else with it. This image of cold air arriving without explanation, of something passing through solid matter without disturbing it, gives Gengar a quality that is more melancholy than frightening. It is a creature defined by its relationship to barriers it cannot be stopped by, moving through a world where most things must go around rather than through. Mewtwo arrived in the first games as a creature whose existence was already finished before the player encountered it. By the time you reach Cerulean Cave and find it standing alone in the deepest room, it has already been created, already escaped, already spent an unknown length of time in isolation, wondering what it was made for. The journals scattered through Cinnabar Mansion describe the process of its creation without sentimentality, written in the detached language of researchers who understood they were doing something extraordinary, but not something kind. The original Mew was discovered in the jungles of South America, according to the in-game documentation, a Pokémon so rare that many scientists believed it to be a myth. A single eyelash was recovered, and from that fragment an entirely new creature was constructed through years of careful and morally ambiguous work. The result was more powerful than anything that had existed before, and entirely without the context that gives power its meaning. Mewtwo's Pokédex entry in the original Red version describes it as a Pokémon created by recombining Mew's genes and notes that it is the result of years of horrific gene splicing experiments. This language was unusually direct for a children's game in 1996, using the word horrific in a way that acknowledged rather than softened the ethical dimension of what had been done. The choice to include that word reflects something important about the original vision for Pokémon, which was willing to let the world of the games contain moral complexity without resolving it into something comfortable. Mewtwo was made to be a weapon and escaped before it could be used as one, and the game never pretends that this history does not matter. The type chart that governs how Pokemon interact in battle has been revised and refined across multiple generations, but its underlying logic follows a set of intuitive principles that connect to the natural world in ways both obvious and surprisingly subtle. Water extinguishes fire, which makes intuitive sense. Fire burns grass, which also follows naturally. But the interactions grow more interesting as you move outward from these obvious pairings. Electric type's moves are super effective against water type Pokemon because water conducts electricity, and a creature composed primarily of water would have no natural defense against a current passing through its body. Flying type Pokemon are vulnerable to electric attacks for a similar reason, because lightning strikes from the sky downward, and a creature in the air has no ground to complete the circuit and dissipate the charge safely. The ground type is immune to electric attacks entirely, and this reflects the physical reality that electricity travels through a conductive path toward the Earth rather than originating from it. A creature that is the Earth itself, or that is so thoroughly connected to the ground that it becomes an extension of it, cannot be harmed by something that is simply trying to reach the place where the creature already is. Psychic type's weakness to dark type attacks is less physical than conceptual. When dark type was introduced in the second generation of games, it was described in Japanese as the evil type, and the relationship it has with psychic type reflects the idea that rational, ordered thought has no framework for understanding or countering something that operates entirely without moral restriction. The darkness is not stronger than the mind. It simply exists in a space the mind cannot map. Ghost type attacks being ineffective against normal type Pokemon reflects the old folklore belief that ghosts can only interact with those who believe in them or who are spiritually attuned to their presence. A perfectly ordinary creature, entirely unremarkable and firmly planted in the physical world, would simply not register a ghost's attempt to cause harm. The ghost passes through, leaving nothing behind. Slowpoke takes approximately 5 seconds to feel pain after being bitten, a delay so extreme that the creature often does not notice injuries until long after they have occurred. This is not simply a Pokédex quirk added for flavor. It connects directly to the way Slowpoke lives in the world, drifting through existence at its own unhurried pace, without urgency or apparent concern for anything happening around it. A creature that cannot feel pain immediately has a fundamentally different relationship with danger than one that responds to it instantly. The shelter that bites onto Slowpoke's tail to begin the evolution into Slowbro is itself altered by the process. Once attached, the shelter cannot release its grip, and the toxins it secretes pass into Slowpoke's body and stimulate its brain in ways that make it slightly more alert and capable. Though evolution is therefore mutual, both creatures changed by their connection to each other, though neither chose the arrangement in any meaningful sense. If Slowbro is somehow forced to release the shelter, it devolves back into Slowpoke, the only case in the original games where a fully evolved Pokemon can return to a previous form. This possibility was described in the Pokédex as something that can happen, not as something that has been observed, which gives it a slightly dreamlike quality, the idea of undone evolution existing as a possibility in the world, even if no one has seen it. Slowking, the alternate evolution introduced in the second generation, arrives through a different interaction with the same shelter. When the shelter bites onto Slowpoke's head rather than its tail, the toxins it releases stimulate an entirely different part of the brain, and the result is a Pokemon of extraordinary intelligence and serene wisdom. The same bite in a different location produces a fundamentally different creature, which suggests that the shelter is not so much the source of Slowking's transformation as the key that unlocks something already waiting inside. Eevee holds a position in the Pokemon world unlike any other creature in the series, defined not by what it is, but by what it could become. Its genetic code is described in the Pokédex as irregular and unstable, which sounds like a flaw but is in fact a remarkable form of flexibility. Most creatures evolve along a single path, one form giving way to another in a sequence that cannot be redirected once it begins. Eevee exists in a state of perpetual potential, capable of reading the conditions around it and reshaping itself in response to whichever element it encounters most persistently. When Eevee is exposed to a water stone, it becomes Vaporeon, a creature so thoroughly adapted to aquatic life that its cellular structure has changed to resemble water itself. The Pokédex notes that Vaporeon can melt into water completely and become invisible, detectable only by ripples on an otherwise still surface. It has not simply learned to swim. It has become something that water recognizes as its own. When the same Eevee is exposed to a firestone, it becomes Flareon, an entirely different adaptation to an entirely different element. The internal temperature of Flareon reaches nearly 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring it to store that heat in a specialized flame sac before releasing it. The same creature, the same flexible genetics, the same potential directed toward fire rather than water, produces something that would burn the water-adapted version to nothing. Each of Eevee's evolutions represents a world in which that particular Eevee encountered different conditions during the critical period of its transformation. It is a meditation on how environment shapes identity, told through the language of a creature that makes that shaping visible. The later evolutions introduced across subsequent generations expand this meditation further. Espeon develops through happiness and daylight, suggesting that emotional warmth and the presence of the sun are themselves a kind of elemental force capable of triggering fundamental change. Umbreon develops through happiness and darkness, making the same emotional state but a different environmental condition produce something almost opposite in its characteristics. Magikarp is, by almost any practical measure, the least capable Pokémon in the original games, and this is entirely intentional. Its Pokédex entries describe it as nearly worthless in battle, capable of doing almost nothing except splashing around ineffectually. It cannot hurt most opponents through normal means. It cannot learn meaningful moves for a very long time. It swims against river currents so weak that it is sometimes swept backward by particularly strong ones. The Pokédex does note, however, that Magikarp has managed to survive in the world for at least 5,000 years without any particular advantage, which suggests that survival and combat effectiveness are not the same thing. Magikarp thrives not because it is powerful, but because it is adaptable, because it can live in water that would be undrinkable to anything else, because its simplicity is itself a form of resilience. What Magikarp is, practically, is a test of patience. The game never tells you explicitly that endurance will be rewarded, but the reward is so dramatic that it has become one of the most well-known transformations in the entire franchise. Gyarados, enormous and furious, and capable of devastating entire landscapes, emerges from a creature that could barely keep itself pointed in the right direction. The Pokédex notes that scientists have spent years trying to understand why Gyarados' transformation produces something so violent when Magikarp itself is so docile, and the answer they have arrived at is essentially that no one is certain. The genetics do not obviously explain it. The biology is unclear. The change happens completely and irrevocably, and the creature that swam weakly against gentle currents is replaced by something that can level cities when sufficiently provoked. This mystery is itself part of what makes the transformation meaningful. If there were a clear mechanical explanation for why patience and persistence produce power, it would become a calculation rather than a lesson. The Safari Zone, which appeared first in Pokémon Red and Blue as a special enclosed area where rare Pokémon could be found and caught, operates according to rules that no other area of the game applies. You cannot use your own Pokemon to battle and weaken the creatures inside. You are given a fixed number of special Safari Balls rather than access to your usual collection. The only tools available to you are bait, which makes a Pokemon more likely to stay, but also more likely to break free, and rocks, which make a Pokemon more likely to be caught, but also more likely to flee entirely. This system produces an entirely different kind of tension than the rest of the game, one based on probability and observation rather than strategic combat. You are watching a wild creature and trying to understand its behavior well enough to guess how it will respond to what you offer it. The creature can leave at any moment, and there is nothing you can do to prevent it, except make choices that you hope will shift the probability in your favor. The Pokemon found in the Safari Zone were often among the rarest available in the games, which meant that players spent considerable time and anxiety navigating this system for the chance at a single encounter. Scyther, Pinsir, Chansey, and Dratini all appeared in the Safari Zone of the original games, each one representing a substantial investment of in-game currency and steps. The time limit imposed on Safari Zone visits, measured in steps rather than real time, created a particular kind of pressure that players experienced differently depending on how methodically or impulsively they moved through the space. A player who ran everywhere would exhaust their steps quickly and leave with little. A player who moved carefully and thoughtfully could cover the same ground in half the steps and encounter twice as many rare creatures in the same visit. Ditto is classified as the transform Pokemon, and the simplicity of that label conceals how genuinely strange its existence is within the logic of the game world. Ditto has exactly one move available to it, Transform, which causes it to copy the appearance, typing, moves, and most of the statistics of whatever Pokemon it is currently facing. It is not a particularly strong Pokemon in most contexts because it must always react to something else rather than establishing its own identity in a battle. It is defined entirely by what it reflects. What makes Ditto extraordinary from a breeding perspective is that it can produce eggs with nearly any other Pokemon in the game, making it the universal partner for players trying to obtain specific offspring. It is the single creature in the entire franchise capable of bridging biological categories that would otherwise have no reproductive relationship with each other, not because of any particular quality it possesses, but because of its fundamental malleability. The Pokédex describes Ditto's cellular structure as amorphous, capable of rearranging at a molecular level to match whatever it encounters. This is presented as a practical description of its abilities, but it also raises quiet questions about what Ditto experiences during those transformations, whether the creature has any persistent sense of itself beneath each new shape it takes. There is a theory, persistent within the Pokemon community for decades, that Ditto is a failed attempt to replicate Mew, which would explain why both creatures share the same lavender-pink coloration, and why Ditto can transform into any Pokemon just as Mew can. The games have never confirmed this, and it is presented in the Pokédex as a point of scientific debate rather than established fact. But the resemblance exists, and the possibility it suggests lingers at the edges of the world's mythology. Ghastly, Haunter, and Gengar form an evolutionary line that was nearly impossible to complete without another player in the original games, because Haunter could only evolve into Gengar through trading across the link cable. This was one of several trade evolutions in the first generation, a mechanic that embedded the social dimension of the game directly into the biological development of certain Pokemon. To have a Gengar, you needed a friend who was willing to accept your Haunter and send it back. The evolution was, in this sense, a transaction built on trust. The Ghost line itself carries a particular aesthetic coherence across its three forms. Ghastly is nearly formless, a sphere of gas surrounded by poisonous vapors that make up most of its visible mass. Its body is so insubstantial that a strong wind can disperse it into nothing, and it must reassemble itself when the gust passes. Haunter becomes slightly more defined, developing hands that float independently of its body and a tongue that it uses to drain the life energy of those it licks. Gengar is the most physically coherent of the three, the most solid, the one that looks most like a creature that could exist in physical space. And yet the Pokédex continues to describe it as passing through walls and emerging from shadows, as if the solidification of its form has not actually made it more present in the material world, but has simply given it a more consistent shape within which to remain absent from it. The team that designed the Ghost line in the original games was working in a context where horror and darkness in children's media operated differently than they do in later decades. Haunter's description as a creature that will follow you home if it takes an interest in you, and that licks you during the night to slowly drain away your life, was included in official Pokédex entries aimed at children without apparent concern that it was unusually dark material. Clefairy was originally intended to be the mascot of the Pokémon franchise, before Pikachu took that role during the production of the anime. The choice makes a certain kind of sense when you examine the original games rather than the television series. Clefairy appears on the box art of the Japanese Red and Blue, releases in some promotional materials, and the Pokémon Stadium games in Japan used a Clefairy as a host character in a way that clearly positioned it as a face of the franchise. Clefairy's habitat in the original games is also suggestive of the importance originally assigned to it. It is found only on Mount Moon, a location the player passes through relatively early in their journey, but which carries an air of significance. The mountain is filled with fossil hunters, researchers, and Team Rocket agents, all drawn to the same location for different reasons, and Clefairy's presence there gives it an atmosphere of mystery and rarity. The Pokédex entry in the original games describes Clefairy as sighted near Mount Moon, where many have gathered seeking the mysterious Moonstone. The connection between Clefairy and the Moonstone is direct and functional, as the stone triggers its evolution into Clefable, but it also places Clefairy within a larger mythology about the moon and what comes from it. Later entries across multiple generations expand this connection, describing Clefairy as arriving from space on meteorites and gathering on nights with a full moon to dance in fields, leaving behind circular patterns in the grass that mirror the shape of the moon above them. It is a creature that arrived from elsewhere and has never entirely settled into the world it landed in, which gives it a quality of gentle alienness that the franchise has carried forward through every subsequent generation. The move Splash, available to Magikarp and a handful of other Pokémon, is perhaps the most famously useless technique in the entire game, a normal type move that does absolutely nothing when used in battle. Its description reads simply that the user just flops around, and players who have encountered it for the first time have often spent several turns waiting for something to happen before realizing that nothing will. The name in Japanese is not splash, but hop, a word that describes the physical action of a fish leaving the water briefly before returning to it. The translation into English as splash introduced a different connotation, one that suggests playing in water rather than briefly escaping it, and this shift in meaning contributed to the move's reputation as something particularly pointless, since splashing water is at least a kind of action, whereas hopping is more clearly an involuntary reflex. What Splash represents within the game's internal logic is the expression of Magikarp's fundamental biological limitation at its current stage of development. The creature has the impulse to move energetically, to leap from the water and demonstrate its vitality, but the movement itself accomplishes nothing externally because Magikarp's physical capacity is not yet sufficient to translate that energy into anything useful. The move persists in the franchise across multiple generations, remaining available to a growing number of Pokémon, and its presence each time it appears is a gentle reminder that the most honest thing a game can sometimes do is show you exactly how little you are currently capable of, and then allow you to become something capable of a great deal more. Alakazam presents one of the more remarkable biological claims in the original Pokédex, described as having an IQ of 5,000, more than enough to memorize the layout of every star in the observable universe. This is an extraordinary number for a children's game, and it sits alongside the claim that Alakazam's brain cells multiply continuously throughout its life, meaning it grows more intelligent as it ages without any apparent upper limit. The brain mass this would eventually produce is never discussed, and the physical strain of carrying it is addressed only by the note that its muscles must compensate for the increasing weight of its head. Alakazam holds 2 spoons at all times, and the Pokédex explains that these spoons are not carried from elsewhere, but emitted from Alakazam's body, materialized from its own psychic energy. The spoons amplify and focus its abilities in a way that the creature cannot achieve without them, which places an interesting constraint on a creature described as possessing near infinite cognitive capacity. Even the most powerful mind in the Pokémon world, at least among those measured in the original games, requires a physical object to achieve its full potential. The evolutionary line begins with Abra, which sleeps for 18 hours a day and teleports away the moment it senses danger, making it nearly impossible to catch through conventional means. The sleep is not laziness, but necessity, as generating psychic power requires more energy than Abra can produce while conscious, and its unconscious mind continues working on problems its waking mind never gets to finish. Kadabra, the middle evolution, carries 1 spoon rather than 2, and the Pokédex notes that a Kadabra appearing in a home is said to cause electronic devices to malfunction and clocks to stop. It is not clear whether Kadabra does this deliberately or whether it is simply an effect of the psychic field it constantly generates, which suggests that even a medium-stage evolution in this line produces more raw psychic output than the surrounding environment can absorb without showing the effects. The legendary birds of the original Kanto region, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres, each inhabit a location that reflects their elemental nature in a way that goes beyond the obvious. Articuno lives in the Seafoam Islands, an ice cave accessible through an elaborate series of boulder puzzles that require the player to reroute the flow of water through the cave system before the deepest chambers become passable. The effort required to reach Articuno is the most physically demanding of the 3, which seems to mirror something about a creature associated with endurance and the particular stillness that comes from extreme cold. Zapdos lives in the power plant, an abandoned industrial facility full of malfunctioning equipment and wild electric-type Pokémon. The choice to place an ancient and legendary bird in a human-made structure rather than a natural environment is unusual and slightly melancholy, suggesting either that Zapdos is drawn to sources of electrical energy wherever it finds them, or that the power plant was built in a place where Zapdos was already living. Moltres lives on Victory Road, the cave that leads to the Pokémon League, the final challenge of the game. It is the only legendary bird that occupies a space humans travel through regularly, rather than a remote or isolated location, and encountering it feels almost incidental compared to the deliberate pilgrimages required to find the other 2. What connects all 3 is the sense that they have been in their respective places for an extremely long time, that the caves and the plant and the mountain have grown around them rather than that the birds arrived and settled in. They are described in the Pokédex as sightings rather than as residents, appearing rarely and leaving marks on the landscape that linger long after they have gone. Snorlax's role in the original games is structural as well as biological because it sleeps in the road. Two Snorlax block two separate routes in Kanto, lying across the path with a contentment so complete that nothing short of a specific musical item will disturb them. They cannot be battled until they are awakened. They cannot be walked around because the routes are designed so that the only way forward passes directly through the space the Snorlax occupies. The Pokemon flute required to wake them is obtained late enough in the game that players who encounter the first sleeping Snorlax before reaching Lavender Town must simply accept that this path is currently closed to them and find another way around. There is something almost philosophically satisfying about this. The world of the game contains a creature so committed to its own rest that it becomes a geographical feature, something that must be navigated around or eventually resolved rather than simply overcome. The Snorlax is not a villain and not a guardian. It is simply very large and very comfortable exactly where it is, and the world must accommodate that fact until someone finds the right note to play. Snorlax eats 400 kilograms of food every day before sleeping, according to its Pokédex entry, and it is entirely unbothered by anything landing on its stomach while it rests, treating anything small enough to not wake it as simply part of the environment. This detail, that Snorlax's sleeping body becomes a surface that other creatures use freely, gives it a quality of passive generosity, an unintentional hospitality extended to anything small enough to appreciate it. Jigglypuff's song appears in the anime as something that causes any listener to fall asleep against their will, a property that the creature finds deeply frustrating because it wants to perform, not to put its audience to sleep. The Pokédex entries across multiple games describe Jigglypuff's song as adjusting its rhythm to match the brainwaves of its audience, synchronizing with each listener's neural patterns and guiding them toward unconsciousness. This framing transforms what seems like a simple sleep attack into something more like a biological empathy, the ability to read the wavelength of another creature's mind and meet it where it is. What Jigglypuff cannot do is stop singing once it has begun. The Pokédex notes that Jigglypuff will continue until it runs out of breath, which can take an extremely long time because it is capable of inflating its body to increase its lung capacity mid-performance. The song and the singer are committed to each other for the duration in a way that neither can easily exit. The marker Jigglypuff uses to draw on the faces of sleeping audiences in the anime is not a canonical part of its biology, but has become so associated with the character that it functions as an identifying feature in cultural memory. This is an interesting example of anime editions becoming more fixed in public understanding than the game details they were built on, a process that has shaped how several Pokémon are perceived across the entire franchise. Wigglytuff, the evolution, retains the singing ability, but loses most of the anime associations and becomes primarily known for its extremely soft and elastic fur, which is so pleasant to touch that any creature that touches it once will want to touch it again immediately. This creates a creature defined by an almost gravitational quality, drawing other beings toward contact through the simple fact of being exceptionally comfortable to be near. The fossil Pokémon that appear across the series represent a particular kind of storytelling, one concerned with loss and recovery and what survives the passage of enormous amounts of time. In the original games, the Old Amber, the Dome Fossil, and the Helix Fossil each contain the preserved genetic material of creatures that lived so long ago that the world they inhabited no longer exists in any form recognizable from the present. The scientists in Cinnabar Island's laboratory can recover something from these fossils, but what they produce is a reconstruction rather than a resurrection, a creature grown from incomplete information filling in the gaps as best it can. Aerodactyl, recovered from the Old Amber, is described as a Pokémon from the age of dinosaurs, though what the Pokédex means by that is never precisely specified. It is fast and aggressive, and clearly designed by whatever evolutionary pressures existed in its original era. But those pressures no longer exist, and Aerodactyl navigates a world it was not made for with an energy that looks like aggression, but might simply be confusion. Kabuto and Kabutops, derived from the dome fossil, were already going extinct in prehistoric times according to the Pokédex, which means that the fossil they left behind captured a creature in the middle of a decline that had been ongoing for millions of years before the fossil formed. Yet what the scientists in Cinnabar revive is a species that was already losing its place in the world before it disappeared from it. This detail makes the revival feel like something other than pure restoration. It raises questions that the games leave unanswered about whether bringing back a creature from a time when it was already struggling serves any purpose other than the satisfaction of demonstrating that the thing can be done. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town is one of the more atmospherically distinctive locations in the original games, a tall building dedicated entirely to the burial of Pokémon who have died in the care of their trainers. Its presence in the game world serves several purposes simultaneously. It establishes that Pokémon can die, which is not otherwise addressed in the gameplay mechanics of the original titles. It creates a space where the emotional relationships between trainers and their Pokémon are treated as having genuine weight, worthy of ritual and remembrance. And it introduces Team Rocket as an organization whose willingness to harm and kill Pokémon for profit sets them apart from the general moral framework of the world. The ghost that blocks the player's path in the tower is the spirit of a Marowak, a mother who was killed by Team Rocket operatives while trying to protect her child. The child, a Cubone, survived and went on to wear its mother's skull as a helmet, a detail the Pokédex provides about all Cubone, rather than treating it as specific to this individual, which suggests that this tragedy is somehow typical of the species' experience. The ritual required to help the Marowak's spirit find peace involves the player using a specific item in its presence and then engaging and defeating it in battle, which is a strange kind of solace if examined too directly. But the Pokémon Tower sequence works because it does not invite direct examination. It works through atmosphere, through the accumulated weight of many small graves, and the persistence of a mother's love, even past the point where love can do anything practical. Cubone's entire design philosophy rests on this mythology of loss. Every Cubone cries for a mother that is almost certainly no longer living, and the tears it sheds dry on the skull it wears, leaving marks that deepen over time. The evolution into Marowak does not erase this grief, but transforms it into something more composed, the mourning still present but carried more quietly. Meowth is one of 3 regional forms of the same Pokémon that developed entirely different characteristics in isolation from each other, a concept that was introduced much later in the franchise's history, but which Meowth exemplifies with unusual clarity. The original Kanto Meowth learns Payday, a move that scatters coins during battle and rewards the trainer with a small amount of in-game currency after victory. This is explained in the Pokédex as a behavior learned from watching humans use coins, a creature that has spent enough time around human commerce to internalize something of its logic. The coin embedded in Meowth's forehead is not a natural feature, but a stylized marking that developed as the species adapted to life near human settlements. The anime's Meowth, the one who travels with Team Rocket and speaks human language, represents a separate development, an individual member of the species who learned human speech specifically because it wanted to impress a Meowth it admired. That Meowth considered human speech to be something sophisticated and desirable In the process of teaching itself to speak, it meant teaching itself to walk upright, to reason in human terms, and to exist in a kind of permanent translation between its own instincts and the language it chose to express them in. This backstory, revealed across several anime episodes, transforms Team Rocket's Meowth from a comedic companion into something more melancholy, a creature that remade itself entirely for a connection that was ultimately rejected, and who now travels the world with companions who genuinely appreciate it, while it continues to believe that what it wants is somewhere else. Chansey is described in the Pokédex as a Pokémon so kind that it will share the eggs it carries with anyone who appears hungry or unwell, a generosity so fundamental to its nature that it functions as a defining biological characteristic rather than a personality trait. The eggs Chansey carries in its pouch are not its own offspring, but a separate product of its body, nutritionally complete and described as extraordinarily delicious, capable of restoring health when consumed. The Pokédex notes that eating one of Chansey's eggs will leave anyone who does so feeling happy and warm, which is a description that goes slightly beyond on the nutritional and into something more like emotional comfort. Blissey, the evolution, amplifies this characteristic to a point that the Pokédex describes as almost involuntary. Anyone who eats a Blissey egg will automatically feel compelled to treat people kindly for a period afterward, as if the egg carries something of Blissey's disposition within it and can pass that disposition along to whoever receives it. This is one of the stranger biological claims in the franchise. The idea that a creature's moral character can be transmitted through its food. Chansey is extremely rare in the original games, appearing infrequently in the Safari Zone and in the wild areas around Fuskia City. Its rarity combined with its extraordinary happiness stat made it a creature that players sought extensively, and its appearance in the anime as a fixture of Pokémon centers helped establish the sense that Chansey's presence was associated with healing and safety in a way that went beyond its individual stats. The transition from Chansey to Happiny in later generations, adding a pre-evolution that is even more round and more cheerfully colored, completed a line whose entire aesthetic logic is built around the idea that generosity makes things rounder and warmer and softer, that kindness accretes into physical form over time. The psychic type was, in the first generation of games, dramatically more powerful than any other type in the game for a combination of reasons that had more to do with oversight than intention. Psychic type was supposed to have two weaknesses that would balance its considerable offensive power. Ghost-type moves were intended to be super effective against Psychic, and Bug-type moves were also intended to provide a counter. In practice, neither of these weaknesses functioned correctly. There were no Ghost-type moves in the original game that dealt direct damage, meaning that even though Psychic types were technically vulnerable to Ghost, there was nothing to exploit that vulnerability with. The Bug-type moves that existed were so weak that even a super effective hit rarely accomplished much in practice. The result was a type that had strong offensive coverage, high-powered moves, fast Pokémon carrying them, and no realistic counter available to players who did not have access to specific Pokémon that were rare enough to be effectively unavailable in normal play. This was corrected beginning with the second generation of games, where the type chart was revised to address the imbalances that experience had revealed. Dark type was added specifically as a counter to Psychic, and the relationship between these two types was written into the game's mythology in a way that gave it thematic coherence, even though its practical origin was a balance patch. The history of the type chart is itself a record of how Game Freak responded to what players actually did with the game versus what had been intended, a conversation between design and use that has continued across every subsequent generation. Lapras carries one of the more poignant Pokédex entries in the original games, describing a Pokémon so intelligent that it understands human speech and so gentle that it will carry people across water without hesitation, but whose numbers have declined so severely from hunting that it has become rare to find even a single one in the wild. This entry acknowledges human responsibility for Lapras's decline without being preachy about it, folding the environmental note into the factual description of the creature in a way that lets the reader draw their own conclusions. The rarity of Lapras in the original games, available only as a single gift from an NPC in Sylph Company rather than findable in the wild, reinforces this framing through the mechanics themselves. The creature is hard to find, not because it is secretive, but because there are not many of them left. Lapras hums gently while carrying passengers, and the Pokédex notes that hearing this humming on a moonlit night out at sea is considered among the most peaceful experiences available to those who spend time on the water. It is described as sharing this music freely, not as a display, but as an expression of something simply present in its nature when conditions are calm. The image of Lapras on water at night, humming to passengers who trust it to carry them somewhere, has a quality of perfect uncomplicated gentleness that the game rarely tries to achieve so directly. Most Pokemon are described in terms of their abilities or their behaviors in combat. Lapras is described in terms of how it makes people feel, which places it in a different register entirely, closer to a presence than a creature. Porygon is the only Pokemon in the original games that is explicitly artificial in its construction rather than biological, created from programming code rather than evolved from any natural process. Its Pokédex entry in red and blue states that it was created using the latest computer technology, which in the context of 1996 had a specific resonance that has shifted over the decades as the technology in question became first familiar and then antique. Porygon was created to operate in cyberspace, a concept that the games gestures toward without fully defining, suggesting a digital frontier that exists alongside the physical world but has its own rules and geography. What Porygon cannot do in the original games is evolve further without an item introduced several generations later. It exists as a completed product in its initial form, a version 1 before anyone thought there would need to be a version 2. Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, introduced across subsequent games, represent the process of continued iteration, each update to the original design producing something that works differently and arguably less predictably than its predecessor. Porygon Z, the final form, is explicitly the result of additional programming modifications that were meant to allow it to function in alien dimensions, but which instead produced erratic behavior and unpredictable outputs. It moves strangely, and its eyes point in different directions, and the Pokédex notes that it behaves oddly, though no one has been able to determine whether this is a malfunction or simply how a Pokémon functions when it has been modified to navigate spaces the modifiers themselves did not fully understand. The Porygon line is the closest the franchise comes to asking directly what it means to make something alive through technical means rather than biological ones, and each generation's answer to that question is slightly more uncertain than the last. The second generation of Pokémon introduced several mechanics that became so fundamental to the franchise that players who came to the series later sometimes assumed they were always present. Held items were new in gold and silver, the ability to give a Pokémon an object to carry that would affect its performance in various ways. This single addition created an entire layer of strategy that had not previously existed, as the right held item could shift the outcome of battles that would otherwise have been determined simply by which Pokémon had stronger stats. Breeding was also new, introduced in a specific location in Johto called the Daycare, where two compatible Pokemon could be left together and would eventually produce an egg if the conditions were right. The breeding system was the primary method through which players could obtain Pokemon with specific moves they could not otherwise learn, as eggs inherited moves from their parents in ways that allowed for combinations unavailable through leveling alone. The day and night cycle was introduced in Gold and Silver, dividing the game world into periods where different Pokemon appeared and different events occurred. Some Pokemon could only be found at night. Others were exclusive to the morning. The odd keystone item, required to encounter Spirit Omb, introduced in later games, represents the most extreme version of this time-gating philosophy, but its origins were in the simple decision to make the world of the games respond to what time it actually was when you were playing. The friendship mechanic also deepened in the second generation, with Pokemon like Espeon, Umbreon, and Blissey all requiring high friendship to evolve, rather than items or level thresholds. This made your relationship with a Pokemon something that had consequences within the game's mechanical language, not just in the narrative sense, but in ways that determined what your team could become. Suicune, Raikou, and Entei are described in the games as the reincarnations of three unnamed Pokemon who died in the fire that burned down the Brass Tower in Ecruteak City, an event that took place 150 years before the events of Gold and Silver. The three spirits were struck by lightning as they perished, and Ho-Oh descended from the sky to restore them to life, transforming them into something more than what they had been. They emerged from the ruins as legendary Pokemon, running immediately into the world as if propelled by the shock of their new existence, and they have been in motion ever since. This mythology is remarkable for how it frames the legendary beasts as creatures who did not begin as legendary. They were ordinary Pokemon who died in a circumstance that attracted the attention of something divine, and their elevation came through loss and restoration rather than through any inherent greatness. They are legendary not because of what they were, but because of what was done to them and what they became in response. Each of the three roams across the landscape of Johto, rather than remaining in any fixed location, which makes them among the most difficult Pokemon to catch in the original Gold and Silver games. They appear on the map as moving dots, relocating every time the player exits an area, and finding them requires either systematic region-by-region searching or a specific strategy involving Pokemon that can prevent their escape. Suicune, in particular, carries a different narrative weight in Crystal version and in the later remakes, where it is given a more developed presence and a specific moment of connection with the player that the other two do not share. It watches the player from a distance before their first encounter, suggesting a quality of attention and assessment that goes beyond the blind flight of the others, as if Suicune's particular nature includes a kind of curiosity about humans that the embodied forces of thunder and fire do not share. Lugia was designed for the second generation as the opposite of Ho-Oh in almost every respect, not just in terms of typing, but in terms of its relationship to the world. Ho-Oh is associated with fire, with resurrection, with the sky, and with warmth, a creature whose presence causes things to come back to life. Lugia is associated with water, with storm, with the deep sea, and with the danger that comes from uncontrolled power. Its wings are so potent that a single flap can create a 40-day storm, so it folds them carefully when it moves among other creatures and lives at the very bottom of the ocean where it can do the least accidental damage. This is a legendary Pokemon defined not by its power, but by its restraint, choosing isolation as an act of consideration rather than preference. The Pokédex frames its ocean floor residence as deliberate and principled, a creature aware enough of what it can do to choose the arrangement most likely to prevent it from doing it carelessly. Lugia's role in the second Pokemon movie is consistent with this characterization, casting it as a creature whose peace is interrupted by external forces rather than one that initiates conflicts. It is reluctant and measured in its responses, and the chaos it is capable of is presented as something it would rather not demonstrate. The pairing of Lugia and Ho-Oh across the two versions of the second generation reflects a design philosophy of creating legendaries that explain each other, whose characteristics only fully make sense in relation to each other. The restoration and the storm, the ascending and the descending, the fire and the sea, none of these are complete pictures on their own. Celebi, the time-traveling mythical Pokémon of the second generation, appears at the Alex Forest Shrine in Johto under specific conditions that were not available in the original games and required events that most players never had access to. Its Pokédex entry describes it as appearing from the future when the forest is peaceful, which is a description that creates a temporal loop rather than resolving it. If Celebi appears from the future, then some future exists in which Celebi decides to travel to the past. But what determines that future exists? The answer implied by the entry is that the peacefulness of the present forest is itself the condition, which means that maintaining the forest calls Celebi here from somewhere that has not yet happened. Celebi's design is small and luminous, with oversized eyes that suggest sensitivity rather than power. It carries no obvious indicators of its temporal ability, which is consistent with a creature whose most significant quality is invisible in the present moment. You cannot see a thing that is not here yet, and Celebi looks like something that might be in several places at once without any of them quite claiming it fully. The mythology around Celebi in later games, particularly in the fourth generation, deepens its relationship with time in ways that connect it to the broader framework of legendary Pokémon, whose domains are absolute rather than elemental. Celebi does not use time. It inhabits it, moving through temporal space the way ordinary creatures move through physical space, with the freedom and the risks that kind of movement involves. The evolution of the franchise through its third generation introduced the concept of abilities, a passive characteristic assigned to each Pokémon that changed how it interacted with the battle system in ways that could be more strategically significant than raw stats. This addition changed the entire character of how Pokémon were evaluated. A Pokémon with a strong ability in a useful situation could outperform a statistically superior opponent who lacked any contextual advantage. Intimidate, which reduced the opponent's attack stat when the Pokémon entered battle, meant that physically powerful sweepers suddenly needed to account for a possibility they had not previously needed to consider. Speed Boost, which increased a Pokémon's speed at the end of each turn, meant that a Pokémon that began a battle at a statistical disadvantage could become the fastest creature on the field before the battle concluded. Abilities also added dimensions of flavor and biological logic to Pokémon that had previously been defined almost entirely by their types and stats. A Pokémon with the Levitate ability was immune to ground-type moves because it floated above the ground rather than standing on it, a mechanical fact expressed as a biological characteristic. A Pokémon with Flash Fire would absorb fire-type moves and grow stronger rather than being hurt by them, a property that suggested something about how fire interacted with the creature's internal chemistry. The Hidden Abilities system, introduced in later generations, gave each Pokémon a third ability that could only be obtained through specific gameplay events, adding another layer to an already complex characteristic. A Pokémon's hidden ability was often functionally different in a significant way from its standard abilities, creating alternate versions of familiar Pokémon that played very differently in strategic contexts despite being the same species with the same statistics. Rayquaza occupies the highest point of the sky above the Hoenn region, living in the ozone layer at an altitude so extreme that it almost never descends to the surface of the Earth. It has lived at this altitude for so long that it feeds entirely on water particles and particles of other elements that exist in that upper atmosphere, a diet so sparse that its mere survival at that altitude is presented as evidence of something fundamentally different about its biology compared to lower-dwelling creatures. Rayquaza is the Pokémon designated to resolve conflicts between Kyogre and Groudon, the forces of sea and land, whose opposition could otherwise result in the permanent reshaping of the world. Its authority over them is not explained in terms of raw power, though it is clearly more powerful than either, but in terms of position. It descends from above the conflict, and its arrival changes the terms of the conflict, not by being stronger than either party, but by being outside the axis along which they oppose each other. This framing of a third force as mediator rather than combatant appears across the legendary triads of the franchise, and Rayquaza represents one of its clearest expressions. The sea and land can fight forever along the line where they meet, but a creature that lives above both and needs neither can offer them a perspective. They do not have the altitude to reach on their own. The eventual introduction of Mega Rayquaza, a form it can achieve without the use of a megastone, because the meteorite dust in its diet serves the same chemical function, made it briefly the most powerful Pokémon in competitive play in a way that required regulatory intervention. The form exists within the logic of the world, but the world's logic had not fully accounted for what would happen when it was expressed. The Pokémon world's relationship with time is complicated by the existence of Dialga, a legendary Pokémon that the mythology of the 4th generation credits with creating time itself through the act of its first heartbeat. This is a creation myth of unusual specificity. Time did not exist before Dialga began to exist, and Dialga's existence is therefore self-referential in a way that resists ordinary logic. Something created time, but that something exists within time, which raises the question of what kind of time existed when the creating happened if time itself was not yet a property of the world. The 4th generation games do not attempt to resolve this paradox, which is the correct approach. Creation myths that resolve cleanly into logical consistency tend to lose something in the resolution, the sense of something that exceeds the capacity of ordinary thought to contain. Dialga's origin works better as a mystery than as an explanation. Palkia, created alongside Dialga, is credited with creating space in the same manner. Its existence made it possible for things to be in one place rather than another, which is the foundational property without which the concept of distinct locations is meaningless. Together, Dialga and Palkia are described as creating the conditions for a world to exist before any specific world had been determined. Giratina, the third member of the creation trio, was banished to the distortion world for its violent nature, leaving the world it had helped to create without ever being permitted to inhabit it fully. The distortion world it was sent to is a space where the physical laws of the ordinary world are reversed or absent, and Giratina has adapted to those conditions to such a degree that returning to the ordinary world requires a specific held item to maintain its alternate form. Spiritomb is constructed entirely from 108 malevolent spirits that were bound to a keystone as punishment for wicked deeds committed during life. The number 108 has specific significance in Buddhist tradition as the number of earthly temptations or desires that must be overcome to achieve enlightenment, which gives Spiritomb's composition a particular resonance when considered alongside the folklore traditions that shaped much of the franchise's mythology. In the original Diamond and Pearl games, obtaining a Spiritomb required an elaborate process involving the old chateau's odd keystone, the underground tunnel system, and 108 separate conversations with other players accessed through the wireless connection system. This was the largest social requirement ever built into a single Pokemon's acquisition, meaning that Spiritom's capture required engaging with exactly as many other players as spirits had been bound into it. Spiritomb had no type weaknesses in the original games, immune to the 3 types that would normally counter its ghost and dark typing. This changed in a later generation with the introduction of Fairy type, which was specifically described in its accompanying mythology as a force capable of countering darkness, giving Spiritomb a weakness it had avoided for multiple generations. The face visible within Spiritomb's form shifts constantly, different expressions cycling through without pattern, which the Pokédex implies reflects the different personalities of the individual spirits still present inside the collective form. The creature has one consciousness, but many internal voices, and what appears on the surface at any given moment depends on which of those voices happens to be closest to the surface at the time. Garchomp is described in its Pokédex entries as capable of flying at the speed of a fighter jet, so fast that it appears as a shimmering distortion in the air rather than a distinct form when moving at full speed. Despite this speed in the air, Garchomp spends most of its time on the ground or burrowing through the earth, a habit that reflects something about its preferred mode of hunting rather than any limitation on its aerial ability. It is fast in the air and comfortable underground, which gives it an unusual range of movement across different physical spaces. Garchomp became one of the most important Pokémon in competitive play during the 4th generation, combining high stats with a dual typing that gave it excellent offensive coverage and a moveset that could be configured for several different strategic roles. Its prevalence in competitive play during that generation was significant enough that it prompted discussion about whether it required official restriction. The design of Garchomp draws from both sharks and fighter jets in a combination that reflects the franchise's characteristic approach to blending animal biology with mechanical or human-made forms. The fins along its body resemble both pectoral fins and swept-back wings, and the overall silhouette suggests something built for speed through its medium rather than something that has adapted to move through it. It looks engineered, which sits interestingly alongside the description of it as a creature that evolved naturally in harsh desert conditions where speed was the primary survival advantage. The Sinnoh region introduced the concept of the Pokémon mythology in a more structured and theologically coherent way than any previous generation had attempted. Arceus is described as the Pokémon that created the universe, shaping existence from nothing using its 1,000 arms, a creature so thoroughly positioned as a creative deity that its canonical status as the most powerful Pokémon is inseparable from its mythological role. What is interesting about Arceus within the game's internal logic is that it is catchable. You can place it in a Pokéball and add it to your party, which is something the game acknowledges without particularly resolving. The mythology says it created the universe. The mechanics say it can be caught at level 80. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the game does not ask the player to choose which truth matters more. Arceus's design supports this duality, a horse-shaped creature wearing a golden wheel that contains the power to change its type depending on which elemental plate it holds. It is divine and flexible at the same time, capable of being whatever is needed in whatever situation it finds itself in, which is perhaps the most important quality for a creature responsible for creating a world in which an enormous variety of situations would eventually need to be navigated. The creation myth that's presented across the Sinnoh games describes Arceus hatching from an egg into a world of nothing, which is itself a paradox, an egg existing before space or time or any place in which an egg could be, and hatching into a nothing it then proceeded to fill. The myth does not explain where the egg came from, which is consistent with the oldest creation stories from many different traditions, all of which eventually arrive at the same unanswerable question and leave it unanswered because that is the only honest thing to do. Zoroark and Zorua, the illusion Pokémon of the 5th generation, represent one of the more elegant applications of a Pokémon's biological ability to a gameplay mechanic. Zoroark can generate perfect illusions of other Pokémon, making it appear in battle as whatever creature entered the party before it, and it can only be revealed through specific moves or items, or through the specific interaction of its typing with what opponents throw at it. A Zoroark disguised as a fire type will still take normal damage from water type moves, revealing through the normal damage number that something is not right with the creature on the field. This ability extends beyond battles in the Pokémon world's mythology, with the Pokédex describing Zoroark as generating illusions of entire landscapes to protect its young and the places where it lives, surrounding its territory with false images of locations that do not exist to mislead anyone who approaches. The illusions are detailed enough that people who encounter them report them as real places for years afterward, creating a folklore of false geography centered on wherever a Zoroark has chosen to live. Zorua, the pre-evolution, uses this same ability on a smaller scale to transform into the appearance of other Pokémon or humans, typically children, to avoid being bullied or threatened. The Pokédex notes that Zorua's transformation into a human child is convincing enough that it can fool adults who are not paying close attention, and that it uses this form to approach humans it is curious about without revealing itself. There is something quietly affecting about a small creature that feels the need to hide its actual form to feel safe, that has learned to present itself as something other than what it is, because what it is has not always been well received. The Unova region's design philosophy represented a conscious choice by Game Freak to create a generation of Pokémon with no direct evolutionary or design connections to any previous generation. All 549 Pokémon available before the post-game of Black and White were new species, encountered without the presence of any creature from the previous 4 generations. This was a deliberate attempt to recreate the experience of encountering Pokémon for the first time without the safety net of familiar faces, requiring players to learn a completely new roster rather than relying on knowledge they had accumulated across previous games. The Unova Pokémon included some of the most conceptually simple and some of the most conceptually elaborate designs in the franchise up to that point. Trubbish and Garbodor, based directly on garbage bags and trash piles, were divisive on release, criticized by some as evidence that the franchise had run out of ideas, and defended by others as a deliberate choice to demonstrate that any concept, no matter how ordinary, could serve as inspiration for a Pokémon. Vanillite, Vanillish, and Vanillux, based on ice cream cones, attracted similar debate. The counter-argument often offered is that Pokémon has always included designs based on objects rather than animals, from Voltorb's Pokéball shape to Magnemite's mechanical construction, and that the distinction between an ice cream cone and a magnet as Pokémon inspiration is not as clear as critics suggest. The Unova region's willingness to include these designs, alongside more traditionally biological ones, reflects an ongoing conversation within the franchise about what a Pokémon is and how narrow or broad that definition can be stretched before something stops feeling like it belongs in the world. Reshiram and Zekrom represent the thematic core of the 5th generation's narrative in a way that few legendary Pokémon have done so directly before or since. Reshiram is associated with truth and fire, a white dragon whose tail generates an engine-like flame capable of altering the climate of the surrounding region. Zekrom is associated with ideals and electricity, a black dragon whose tail generates electromagnetic energy sufficient to cause thunderstorms across an entire area. The story of Black and White presents two heroes from ancient times who once shared a single legendary dragon, which subsequently split into Reshiram and Zekrom when the brothers' shared ideals fragmented into a disagreement about whether truth or ideals were the more fundamental value. The split itself is the narrative, the story of what happens when a unified perspective divides, and each half insists that its portion contains the whole. What makes this mythology effective as a narrative frame is that neither truth nor ideals is presented as definitively superior. The game that focuses on Reshiram assigns truth as the corresponding value, and the game that focuses on Zekrom assigns ideals, but neither game argues that its associated value is correct and the other wrong. The conflict between the two brothers was real, and the division was real, and what matters in the present is not which of them was right, but what the player in the present chooses to stand for. This is a more sophisticated moral framework than most games in the franchise had attempted, asking players to think about the difference between what is true and what one is committed to, and whether those two things can ever fully align. The fairy type, introduced in the 6th generation, was designed specifically to counter the dragon type, which had accumulated power across multiple generations to a degree that threatened the competitive balance of the game. Dragon type was strong offensively and defensively, with very few weaknesses and the ability to hit most other types neutrally or worse. The introduction of fairy type created a new vulnerability for dragons, while also providing a counter to the dark and fighting types that had been dominant in competitive play. The mythology built around fairy type to explain its relationship with dragon type draws from a tradition of folklore in which fairy creatures are presented as antithetical to dragons, as light is opposed to darkness, as natural enchantment is opposed to reptilian power. The Pokédex entries for many fairy-type Pokémon describe their power as coming from a source fundamentally different from the physical or elemental forces that other types draw on, something more like an ambient field of influence than a concentrated force. The fairy type also gave Pokémon like Clefairy and Jigglypuff, which had been normal types since the beginning, a typing that felt more consistent with their described abilities and mythology. Clefairy, which arrived from space and gathered under the moon, was always going to feel slightly misaligned with a typing that described the most ordinary possible category of creature. The fairy type acknowledged something that the design of these Pokémon had always implied. Sylveon, the fairy type evolution introduced in the same generation, extends its ribbon-like feelers toward others and generates a field of calm that reduces the will to fight in anyone caught within it, which is a description of power expressed entirely in terms of emotional influence rather than physical force. It is one of the clearest statements in the franchise of what fairy-type power is actually supposed to feel like. Zygarde, the legendary Pokémon of the 6th generation's Kalos region, represents one of the most structurally unusual concepts in the franchise's history. Its core form is a small green and black creature with a single visible eye, containing only 10% of the cells that make up the complete Zygarde. The 50% form is a serpentine creature of considerable size. The 100% form is a massive bipedal creature whose body contains all of Zygarde's constituent parts, assembled into their most powerful configuration. What makes Zygarde conceptually interesting is that the cells making up these forms are distributed across the world and are capable of independent movement and minimal autonomous function. Individual Zygarde cells and cores can be found across Kalos, not as passive objects, but as entities with some degree of awareness, gathering information about the state of the ecosystem and reporting back to the assembled form. Zygarde is the Pokémon designated as the guardian of the ecosystem, the force responsible for preserving the balance of the natural world when that balance is threatened. It only assembles into its most powerful forms when the ecological damage reaches a threshold that requires intervention at the level of its full capacity, which means that a fully assembled Zygarde is itself evidence of a crisis rather than simply a display of power. The idea of a guardian that exists in fragments, gathering itself only when necessity demands it, is one of the more unusual framings of legendary power in the franchise. Most legendaries are powerful and present and obvious. Zygarde is powerful and dispersed and invisible until something goes genuinely wrong. Solgaleo and Lunala, the legendary Pokémon of the 7th generation, are described in Alolan mythology as the children of Cosmog, a creature so small and so unremarkable in appearance that it does not initially suggest anything remarkable about its eventual transformation. Cosmog is tiny and nebula-like, a floating collection of cosmic particles that drifts without apparent direction. Its eyes are disproportionately large for its body and give it an air of innocent bewilderment, rather than the composed authority one might expect from something that will eventually become a creature that tears holes between dimensions. Solgaleo, one of Cosmog's ultimate forms, is described as a creature that absorbs light and stores it within its body, radiating a light so bright during its movements that it functions as a small sun rather than a creature moving through the world. The third eye on its forehead opens when it enters its radiant sun phase, and the Pokédex describes the universe depicted on its body as being a representation of where it travels when it passes through ultraspace. Lunala, the other ultimate form, is described as one who calls the moon, its wingspan generating a field of darkness in which stars become visible even in daylight. It also passes through ultraspace, collecting cosmic energy on the other side and returning with it to the world it departed from, a cycle of gathering and returning that makes it function almost like a living moon in terms of its relationship with light and darkness. The Alolan tradition of referring to Solgaleo as the beast that devours the sun and Lunala as the beast that calls the moon frames enormous power in the language of myth rather than science, which is appropriate for creatures whose existence sits at the boundary between the physical world and something much stranger beyond it. Marshadow, a mythical Pokémon from the 7th generation, has the ability to slip into the shadows of people and Pokémon and absorb their techniques and capabilities, learning their fighting styles by inhabiting the darkness they cast. The Pokédex describes it as a timid creature despite this remarkable capability, one that prefers to remain hidden and rarely demonstrates its power unless it has no other option. A creature capable of absorbing the skills of anyone it shadows, choosing to remain in the shadows, not because it is hunting, but because it is afraid, is a more psychologically complex portrait than most Pokémon receive. The design reflects this combination of capability and timidity, a small dark form with bright green eyes that look simultaneously alert and apprehensive, positioned low as if ready to disappear into the nearest shadow at the first sign of attention. Its power and its fear are both genuine, neither canceling the other out. Eternatus, the legendary Pokémon at the center of the 8th generation's narrative, arrived from outer space inside a meteorite 50 million years before the events of the games, remaining dormant in the Earth until the story draws it out. Its energy output is so extreme that it was responsible for the Dynamax phenomenon that defines the 8th generation's battle mechanic, the ability of Pokémon to grow to enormous size in specific locations. The Galar region was essentially shaped by Eternatus's presence underground, its energy seeping into the earth and creating the Pokémon power spots that allow Dynamax to occur anywhere within range. This is an interesting inversion of the usual legendary Pokémon mythology, where the creature's power is expressed through active presence rather than historical influence. Eternatus was doing nothing for 50 million years, and in doing nothing, it was remaking the world around it, simply by existing within it. The Eternamax form of Eternatus, which appears during the game's climax, has the highest base stat total of any Pokemon in the franchise at the time of its introduction, a number so large that its body effectively cannot be contained or controlled, and the form is never available for player use, even after catching the base Eternatus. The stories that Pokemon tell across 8 generations of games, films, and other media form a consistent mythology about the relationship between creatures and the world they inhabit. Every legendary, every mythical, every ordinary creature living in the grass along a route in a region whose name you may have forgotten, all of them carry some piece of a picture that is too large to see all at once and too detailed to summarize without losing something essential. The water types tell a story about adaptation, about finding the shape of what carries you and becoming part of that shape until the distinction between swimmer and water is no longer clear. The fire types tell a story about energy, about the relationship between heat and life, about what burns cleanly and what burns in ways that cannot be controlled. The psychic types reach towards something that cannot be physically located, the space between one mind and another, where information travels in ways that the body was not built for. Every type is a story about what kind of power exists in the world, and what that power costs the creature that carries it, and the balance between all of them is what makes the world feel complete, rather than weighted in any single direction. The Pokemon that are the hardest to find are not always the most powerful. Some of the rarest are small and gentle and hide in places that require patience to reach, not because they are guarding something, but because they simply prefer quiet over exposure. Finding them is its own kind of reward, the discovery that what was hidden was not threatening, merely private. There is a Pokemon in the ocean that sings to itself when the water is calm, a song that humans who have heard it describe as simultaneously deeply familiar and entirely unlike anything that was ever made by human hands. There is a Pokemon in the mountains that marks the passage of seasons by changing the color of its body, winter white to spring flowers, to summer green to autumn gold, never the same arrangement twice. There is a Pokemon in the old forest that has been walking the same path between the same trees for so long that its footprints have become permanent features of the forest floor, paths that the other creatures who live there follow without knowing what made them. Every region contains things like this, small and patient and entirely unhurried, going about the business of existing in ways that the player may or may not notice, depending on how slowly they move through the world. The accumulated weight of all of these facts, taken together, produces something greater than any individual detail. It produces a sense of a world that has been thought about carefully and continuously, where the creatures that inhabit it are not arbitrary, but are each the expression of some idea about what life is, or what power means, or what happens when something has been alive long enough to become part of the landscape around it. The Trick Room move, which reverses the order of action for 5 turns so that slower Pokemon act before faster ones, is one of the more conceptually interesting mechanics in the competitive game. Within the fiction of the Pokemon world, it implies that something about the space within a battle can be altered so that the relationship between speed and action sequence is inverted. The game describes it as a peculiar space being created, but what that peculiar space actually is, and how a Pokemon's move creates it, is left entirely abstract. The competitive effect is clear and well documented. The physical or metaphysical mechanism by which a Pokemon generates an inverted temporal field during a battle is not addressed anywhere in the series, and the entries for Pokemon that frequently use the move in competitive play do not explain what they are actually doing to produce the effect. The Pokemon electrode and its tendency toward explosion is handled in the Pokédex with remarkable bluntness. Multiple entries describe Electrode as finding joy in exploding, as experiencing something positive in the moment of self-destruction. The game treats this as a personality quirk, a defining characteristic of the species, and presents it without apparent concern for what it implies about the creature's psychology or about the ethics of owning and battling with a creature that experiences its own destruction as pleasurable. The question of whether Electrode has anything resembling a stable sense of self given its relationship to self-destruction has been noted by players over the years, but it has never been addressed by the games themselves. It is simply a fact about Electrode, presented alongside its other facts without any additional context. The Pokémon world contains a significant number of Pokémon whose Pokédex entries describe behaviors or abilities that would be deeply dangerous if they operated without restraint in inhabited areas. Gengar is described as lurking in shadows and lowering the temperature of a room when it appears, which the game presents as a sign of its presence, but which the entries sometimes describe as causing the temperature drop intentionally. Haunter is described as approaching sleeping humans and touching them in ways that are intended to be malicious, though the entries vary in how seriously they frame the danger. Parasect is described as a Pokémon whose body has been entirely taken over by a fungal organism, with the original creature's consciousness no longer present in any meaningful sense, which raises ethical questions about catching and battling a creature that may have no agency of its own. None of these implications are addressed in the main game narratives, which allow these Pokémon to be caught and used just like any other, suggesting either that the Pokédex entries are hyperbolic or that the game world has normalized the presence of creatures with genuinely dangerous properties to a degree that ordinary human inhabitants no longer find remarkable. The process by which a Pokémon becomes a starter, one of the three offered to beginning trainers at the start of their journey, has never been explained within the fiction of the series. 3 Pokémon are always available, drawn from different evolutionary types and representing different strengths and weaknesses. They are housed in laboratory settings, apparently comfortable with human presence, and docile enough to be handed to a 10-year-old who has never trained a Pokémon before. The origin of those specific 3 is never addressed. Were they specifically bred for the purpose of being offered to new trainers? Were they caught from the wild and socialized over time? The professor who provides them is characterized as a researcher, but the research that connects to the provision of starting Pokémon is never described. The starters simply exist in their Pokéballs, waiting, and the game asks no further questions about how they came to be there. The presence of Ditto in the Pokémon world is one of the most quietly influential mysteries in the series. Ditto can transform into any Pokémon it encounters, replicating their appearance, their moves, and their physical form. It is also uniquely able to breed with nearly any Pokémon species, serving as a universal breeding partner in the daycare system. The combination of these 2 properties has attracted significant speculation because they suggest a degree of biological universality that no other Pokémon possesses. Ditto's cellular structure, described in Pokédex entries as recombinant at a fundamental level, is the explanation the game offers for its transformative ability. But why a single species would have evolved such radical flexibility in a world where specialization is the norm for every other Pokémon is not addressed. Ditto occupies a biological category of its own, and the entries acknowledge its uniqueness without explaining what drove the evolution of such universality. The Pokémon known as Porygon was created artificially using software, making it the first Pokémon that was not born or evolved but programmed into existence. Its subsequent evolutions, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, were produced through items that modified or upgraded its software. The series treats this as another normal its evolutionary pathway, differing from biological evolution only in its mechanism. But the implications of a Pokémon that is software rather than biology are never fully examined. Can Porygon feel pain? Can it be harmed by physical attacks in the same way that biological creatures can? The game assigns it standard HP and damage mechanics, treating it as physically equivalent to biological Pokémon in battle, but the entries note that it was not designed to function in the real world, and that certain bugs in its programming produce the unstable Porygon Z form. If Porygon Z's instability is the result of a programming error, what does it mean for a creature to have a personality shaped by a software bug? And who is responsible for the consequences of that error? There is a building in Pokémon Black and White 2 that was not in the original Black and White, positioned in a city that was substantially rebuilt between the two games. The city in question shows significant physical changes between the two game sets, with areas that were previously accessible now changed or replaced, and areas that were inaccessible now opened. The game acknowledges these changes explicitly, treating them as the result of 2 years of in-world time passing between the events of the first and second games. The rebuilding of that city and the story behind why it was built differently the second time is described in fragments through conversations with characters who were present during the original events and have since changed. But certain elements of the rebuilding, particularly decisions that seem to reflect choices made by specific characters for reasons that are hinted at but not confirmed, are left without complete explanation. The city, as it appears in Black and White, too carries the shape of a story that the game assumes the player already knows from the first games, and the gaps in that story are filled by implication rather than direct narration. The lore surrounding the Pokémon known as Rotom is particularly rich in unresolved dimensions. Rotom is described as a Pokémon made of electricity that can inhabit and control mechanical devices, taking on different forms depending on the appliance it possesses. The game introduced this mechanic in Diamond and Pearl, where Rotom could be found in an old television set in a secret room accessed through a specific location. The forms Rotom can take in later games are varied and include household appliances, which the game treats as whimsical and charming. But the underlying nature of Rotom as a being that inhabits and controls machines raises questions about the relationship between the creature and the devices it occupies. When Rotom leaves a device, does the device retain any trace of Rotom's presence? Does the device experience anything while Rotom is inside it? The game does not treat these as serious questions, but the design of Rotom, a creature that merges with and animates non-living objects, implies a kind of relationship between consciousness and machinery that the series has never fully explored. The games set in the Kalos region introduced a storyline involving a weapon of extraordinary destructive power that was used 1,000 years before the events of the game by a king who was seeking to save a specific person. The details of that storyline involve a flower that grows in abundance in one part of the region, and that is associated with death and with the life energy that was drawn from Pokémon to power the weapon. The legend is described clearly enough, but the ethical and emotional dimensions of what the king did, the scale of the destruction caused, and the way that destruction is remembered or not remembered by the people of Kalos 1,000 years later are handled briefly in the main narrative. The villain of Pokémon X and Y interprets the story of the weapon differently from the player character, and the game frames his interpretation as wrong, but the elements of the legend that support his reading of events are present enough in the text that the question of whether the king was simply justified or simply monstrous is more complicated than the game's resolution suggests. The nature of the weapon itself is not fully described. What kind of force does it use? The game calls it life energy, but what that means in terms of the biology of the Pokemon involved, whether their life energy is something distinct from their bodies, or whether drawing it away is simply a more efficient form of physical destruction, is left as undefined. The flower that grows at the site of the ancient destruction is described as having absorbed that energy over the centuries, which implies that life energy persists in soil and can be taken up by plants, which in turn implies a specific and unusual theory of what life is and how it moves through the world. None of these implications are developed into a coherent framework. The Zygarde forms, introduced as supplementary content to the Kalos generation and expanded in Sun and Moon, describe a Pokemon that exists in multiple incomplete states and assembles into its complete form only when the ecosystem it monitors is sufficiently threatened. The cells that make up Zygarde are distributed throughout the region, apparently invisible to and undetected by most inhabitants, constantly monitoring the state of the natural world. The complete form of Zygarde is described as possessing power that exceeds even the other legendary Pokemon with which it is associated. But why the cells of such a powerful being would spend most of their existence in dispersed and incomplete forms, rather than simply maintaining the complete and powerful form that is theoretically more effective at protecting the ecosystem, is not addressed. The mystery of Zygarde's cellular nature has the shape of a biological argument, but the game does not provide the biology that would resolve it. There is an exchange in Pokemon Platinum between the player and a character who is investigating the myths of the Sinnoh region that contains a line which researchers have examined carefully without arriving at consensus about what it means. The character describes the legends of the creation mythology surrounding the legendary Pokemon of that region, and then says that the myths do not agree with each other on a specific point. The point of disagreement is mentioned briefly, and then the conversation moves on. The game never returns to that specific disagreement, or explains what the differing accounts say, or which, if either, is considered authoritative. The disagreement was presumably introduced deliberately, as a signal that the mythology of the region is layered and contested rather than settled, but it also functions as a genuine loose end, a detail that points towards something the game never quite says. The treatment of the relationship between the games and the anime has produced its own set of mysteries for players who have tried to understand how the two versions of the Pokemon world relate to each other. The anime and the games share names, places, and species, but differ in their rules and their histories in ways that make direct comparison difficult. Ash Ketchum, the protagonist of the anime, ages extremely slowly relative to the events he participates in, which the show handles by simply not addressing it. Pikachu's refusal to evolve is a character choice in the anime, but is mechanically the player's decisions in the games. The gym leaders in the anime sometimes differ in personality or backstory from their game counterparts, and major events in the game narrative are reflected in the anime in forms that may not be fully consistent. The question of whether the games and the anime are meant to be understood as different versions of the same world or as genuinely separate worlds that happen to share aesthetics has never been answered with the precision that would settle it. The franchise has generally treated the two as related but distinct, using phrases like the Pokemon world to refer to a general setting that encompasses both without requiring them to be identical. But the degree of their separation is something that each player and fan has to work out individually, guided only by their own sense of which details feel like they should be consistent and which feel like they simply belong to different versions of the same broad idea. The Pokemon world's relationship to science is one of its most enduring mysteries as a setting. The world contains technology that is clearly advanced, including instantaneous communication, the digitization of matter, and medical restoration that is beyond anything available in the real world. But it also contains institutions and systems that resemble those of a mid-20th century Japan, with gyms and professors and local badges that feel almost quaint compared to the technology that runs alongside them. The coexistence of those two technological registers has never been addressed as a narrative feature. The world simply has both, and the player moves through them without being asked to notice the gap. Who built the Pokémon transfer system? What do they do for other areas of the world's technology? Why is the infrastructure of battle and collection so much more advanced than almost any other area of the world's apparent economy? The game's economic system is itself an unresolved mystery, in the sense that it has clearly been thought about without being made explicit. Players earn money from battles, use it to buy items, and otherwise engage with a market that seems to function according to something like ordinary commercial logic. But the underlying economics of a world where wild animal capture is a widespread practice, where battling trained creatures is the primary sport, where certain legendary creatures could theoretically be used to reshape physical geography, and where a group of people can mount world-threatening operations using trained creatures as their primary tool of enforcement, are never accounted for. The world functions economically, but how it functions, what sustains it, what the labor market looks like, what happens to the regions of the world that are not explored in the games, all of these are mysteries that the series has never engaged with directly. The recurring presence of the professor archetype in each region of the Pokémon world, always a researcher, always the person who provides the starting Pokémon, always named after a type of tree, has never been explained as a pattern within the fiction. The games treat it as simply how things are organized in different parts of the world, a consistent institutional structure that produces consistent institutional roles. But the fact that every region produces its own version of the same role suggests either a global organization that trains and positions researchers in each area, or a tradition so entrenched that it reproduces itself independently in every culture that develops Pokémon research. The game has acknowledged the pattern through humor and meta-reference without explaining what produces it, so the behavior of Pokémon in the wild relative to their behavior in captivity is one of the quiet mysteries that underlies the entire premise of the series. Wild Pokémon attack when encountered, behave according to their species' instincts, and may or may not be catchable depending on how the battle proceeds. Caught Pokémon almost immediately begin displaying loyalty to their trainer, learning new moves, growing stronger through experience, and eventually forming emotional bonds that the game represents through the happiness mechanic. The transition from wild creature to companion happens extremely quickly and is treated as unremarkable, but the mechanism by which a creature raised in the wild with no prior exposure to human trainers adapts so quickly and so completely to a relationship that has no equivalent in its natural environment has never been explained. The question of whether Pokémon can communicate with each other in ways that humans cannot observe is raised by certain entries without being resolved. Several Pokémon are described as communicating through telepathy, ultrasonic waves, or chemical signals that human senses cannot detect. Certain entries describe Pokémon responding to distress signals from other members of their species that occur beyond human hearing range. The social structures of certain Pokémon species are described as complex and hierarchical in ways that human observers have documented without fully understanding. The possibility that Pokémon have interior lives, social relationships, and communication systems that are entirely invisible to the trainers who catch and battle with them is suggested repeatedly by the games without ever being developed into a sustained theme. It sits at the edge of the world's acknowledged facts, present but not examined, like something seen in peripheral vision that disappears when looked at directly. The deepest mystery in the Pokemon world may be the one that the games have been most careful never to touch directly. Every player who has spent enough time with any Pokemon game has felt, at some point, that the world they are moving through contains more than is visible. The routes between cities, mostly empty of human habitation, feel like they lead somewhere beyond the edge of the map. The caves and underwater passages feel like they connect to spaces the game has not shown. The legends that the characters mention in passing, the histories they reference without telling, the places they name without locating, all of them contribute to the persistent sense that the world does not end at its boundaries, that it continues beyond the reach of the player into something that has not yet been rendered. That sense is a product of design, of careful choices made about what to include and what to leave invisible. The best worlds are always larger than what they show, and Pokemon has always understood that the shadow of what is unseen is part of what makes the visible feel real. The mysteries that remain unsolved in the Pokemon world are not gaps in the fiction. They are the evidence of a world that is taking itself seriously, that believes in its own existence beyond the boundaries of any individual game, and that trusts its players to feel the difference between a world that ends and a world that simply has not yet been fully explored. The questions that have accumulated across more than 25 years of games, anime, manga, and supplementary materials are not a problem to be solved. They are part of what the world is. They are the gaps through which imagination enters, the spaces where the player's own sense of the world fills in what the game has chosen to leave open. The old man by the lake, the burned mansion on Cinnabar Island, the unfinished journal on an island far from any route, the abandoned power plant where a legendary creature lives alone among machines that no longer run. All of these are places where the world is showing you its edges without telling you what lies beyond them. And that is a gift. A world without mysteries is a world that has told you everything it knows, and there is something finite and a little sad about that. A world that keeps its mysteries, that adds new ones with each new game and never quite resolves the old ones, is a world that has decided to stay alive in the imagination of everyone who has ever traveled through it. The Pokemon world has made that decision clearly and consistently across its entire history, and the mysteries that remain are proof of it. They wait in the margins of the Pokédex, in the code that no official tool will let you read, in the journals left behind by people who are never named, in the lines of dialogue that arrive without context and depart without resolution. They wait in the places between the places, in the dark of the cave before the music starts, in the silence of the route at night when only the sounds of distant wild Pokemon reach you across the tall grass. The Pokemon known as Absol appears before disasters, which the Pokédex entries describe as a behavior that humans have long misunderstood as causing the disasters, rather than simply predicting them. The entries note that Absol has spent centuries being hunted and feared because of this misunderstanding, driven to isolated mountain regions where it lives alone or in very small groups. The mystery at the heart of Absol's design is how it perceives the disasters it predicts. The entries describe it as possessing a sensory apparatus that detects natural disturbances before they manifest, but they do not describe what that perception feels like from inside the creature or how Absol decides to act on what it senses. Does Absol choose to appear near human settlements when disaster is imminent, or is it drawn there involuntarily by whatever sense it is using? Is the approach toward human presence a form of warning, a behavior that developed over generations in response to some connection between Absol and human communities, or is it simply that the same natural disturbances that Absol senses also push it out of its normal habitat toward lower ground? The game has never answered these questions, and the entries that reference Absol's long history of persecution do so in a tone that is sympathetic without being explanatory. The tragedy of Absol's existence, as the entries frame it, is that it is doing something altruistic that is consistently misread as malevolent. But the mechanism that makes the altruism possible, the nature of the disaster sense, and how it functions biologically, is presented as simply a feature of the species, without the kind of grounding in fictional science that other unusual abilities sometimes receive. The mystery of what Unknown is and what it represents is one of the oldest and deepest in the series. Unknown are a group of Pokémon, each one shaped like a letter of the alphabet or a punctuation mark, and they are found in specific ruins in the Johto region where similar letter-based script is carved into the walls. The game describes their relationship to a specific dimension and suggests that Unknown may have existed before ordinary Pokémon, or may exist in a different relationship to the physical world than other creatures. The entries note that Unknown link minds when they gather in large numbers, and that the nature of the phenomena produced by that collective has been observed but not understood. In the third Pokémon film, which expands on the Unknown's lore in ways that feel more definitive than the games, their collective ability produces effects that cross the boundary between imagination and reality. But the film's events are not clearly established as canonical to the games, leaving the question of what Unknown can actually do as something the games raise without committing to. The ruins in Johto, where Unknown are found, are themselves a mystery in terms of who built them. The symbols on the walls are identical in appearance to the Unknown themselves, which raises the question of whether the ruins were built in honor of the Unknown by people who observed them and incorporated their shapes into writing, or whether the Unknown themselves are somehow responsible for the shapes of the symbols in a more direct way, perhaps through the phenomenon of their appearance influencing the development of writing in the region. The game presents both possibilities as open without preferring either, and the subsequent games that revisit the ruins of Alph add details without resolving the underlying uncertainty. The Pokémon known as Xatu stands and stares at the sun, according to its entries, because it is watching the past and the future simultaneously. The entries across generations describe Xatu as having a sense of time that is entirely unlike ordinary perception, one in which the distinction between what has happened and what will happen is not as sharp as it is for other creatures. The entries also note that Xatu sometimes refuses to move because it has foreseen a terrible future and has decided that nothing it does can change it. The philosophical dimension of this characterization is unusual for a Pokémon entry and has never been developed into a story or a theme in any main game. Xatu is a Pokémon you catch on a route, use in battle, and may or may not train to its final form. The idea that it carries within it a perception of time that makes ordinary action feel pointless is a tragedy that the game introduces and then simply leaves in the margins of the Pokédex, too specific to be accidental, too unexplored to be resolved. There is a connection between certain Pokémon designs and real-world archaeological objects that has been documented by researchers outside the games, but never confirmed by the designers. Claydol, for example, bears an obvious visual resemblance to the dog figurines found at archaeological sites across Japan, small clay figures from the Jomon period whose purpose and meaning archaeologists continue to debate. The Pokédex entries for Claydol reinforce this connection by describing it as an ancient clay figure that was brought to life by a mysterious ray of light, echoing both the Jomon origins and the broader mythology around animated idols and golems. The entries note that Claydol's true nature remains unknown even to researchers in the Pokémon world, which is a phrase that appears rarely in Pokédex entries and signals that the designers wanted to emphasize genuine uncertainty rather than simply leaving the creature's biology undescribed. Whether the real-world connection to Dogu figurines that was the starting point for Claydol's design, or whether it emerged through the design process is not documented. The alignment between the creature and the real archaeological object is specific enough to be clearly intentional, but the direction of intention, which came first, the object or the creature, is not something the designers have addressed publicly. The broader question of how Game Freak conducts research into the cultural and natural references that inform its designs is one that has never been thoroughly answered, though interviews and developer commentary across the years have provided fragments of insight that suggest the process is more organic and less systematic than a comprehensive design document would imply. The behavior of the legendary Pokemon Celebi across the games it appears in is one of the more genuinely puzzling features of its characterization. Celebi is described as a time traveler, capable of moving through time and bringing life back to dying forests. The entries describe it as appearing in places that are healthy and full of life, and is capable of returning to the past to ensure that damage done in the present cannot permanently affect the natural world. The mechanics of how Celebi's time travel works within the game's logic have never been established. If Celebi can travel through time freely, the implications for the history of the Pokemon world are significant, because a creature that can undo environmental damage by traveling to the past would presumably have used that ability during the many catastrophic events described in the series' mythology. The game does not address why Celebi has not corrected historical disasters, or whether its time travel is subject to limitations that prevent it from acting in exactly those situations. The item, known as the GS Ball, which appeared in the original anime as a mysterious object with no clear explanation, and which was part of a storyline that was never completed in the way originally planned, has a version in the games that functions as a key item used in a specific Pokemon event. The game and anime versions of the GS Ball are related in name and appearance, but were developed along different narrative paths, and the anime's version of the object is one of the more famous cases of a storyline being altered significantly from what was originally intended. The original plan for the GS Ball's reveal, which was connected to a specific legendary Pokemon that was ultimately revealed through different means in a film instead, is documented partially in interviews and statements from people involved in the anime's production, but the full account of why the change was made and what the original storyline would have involved has not been completely told in any single source. What was meant to be inside the GS Ball and what that revelation would have felt like in the context of the anime as it existed at the time is a mystery that the available documentation hints at without fully resolving. The Pokemon world's relationship to death at the species level, as opposed to death in battle, is something that the entries address with more directness than might be expected. Certain Pokemon are described in ways that explicitly reference mortality, including creatures that were created from the souls of people, or Pokemon who died in specific circumstances, creatures whose presence is associated with death in ways that go beyond simple ghost typing, and creatures whose Pokédex entries describe the deaths of other beings in their vicinity in terms that suggest a causal relationship rather than mere coincidence. The entries for Yamask describe a creature that holds a mask that was once its human face, retaining memories of its life before death. The entry notes that Yamask sometimes looks at the mask and cries. This characterization is one of the most direct engagements with grief and mortality in the Pokédex, and it has never been developed further in any game narrative. What would it mean to own a Yamask as a trainer? What would it mean to battle with a creature that is the spirit of a dead human, that cries when it looks at its own former face, that carries memories of a life it can no longer access? The game treats catching and training Yamask as equivalent to catching any other Pokémon without acknowledging the ethical weight that the entry's characterization would imply. This is not necessarily a failure of the game's design. It may reflect a deliberate choice to let the Pokédex carry emotional weight that the gameplay does not pursue, allowing the player to experience the game as a cheerful adventure, while the margins of the world hint at something much more melancholy. The two registers coexist without contradiction, in the same way that children's stories often contain elements that read very differently to adults, present without insistence, available to anyone who looks but not forced on anyone who does not. The relationship between Pokémon and their natural habitats is described in enough detail across the entries to suggest a world with genuine ecological complexity, but that complexity is only visible in fragments. The food chains implied by predator and prey entries are never mapped comprehensively. The effects of catching large numbers of wild Pokémon on the populations of species in different routes are never addressed within the fiction. The seasonal changes described in certain entries and reflected in some games' mechanics are not connected to the behavior of the human population in any explicit way. The world feels ecologically real in the sense that it uses the language of ecology, describing habitats and behaviors and relationships, without being ecologically coherent in the sense that those descriptions resolve into a consistent picture of how the natural world of that setting actually functions. Well, what would the Pokémon world look like if it were mapped ecologically in full? If someone were to trace all of the predator-prey relationships implied by the entries and assemble them into a coherent food web? The answer is that it would probably not resolve cleanly, because the entries were written over many years by many different people without a shared ecological framework. Some Pokémon eat berries, some eat other Pokémon, some eat electricity or sunlight or sorrow. The diversity of energy sources and metabolic strategies described in the entries is wide enough that any attempt to assemble them into a single coherent ecosystem would require significant additional work to bridge the inconsistencies. The game does not ask the player to perform that assembly, and the world functions perfectly well for its intended purpose without resolving the ecological questions. But for anyone who finds those questions interesting, they remain open. The mystery of what happens to the world of Pokémon between games is one that has been explored more thoroughly in recent years, with the release of games that take place at different points in time relative to each other. The games set in Galar reveal that the region has a history extending back many centuries, with records of legendary Pokémon activity and ancient kings that predate the contemporary setting by generations. The games set in Hisui are explicitly historical, depicting an era in Sinnoh's past before the contemporary game settings, showing a version of the world where Pokémon were not yet integrated into human society in the way they are in modern games. But the events that connect the historical settings to the contemporary ones, the process by which humanity's relationship with Pokémon changed from wary coexistence to the normalized partnership of the main series, are described only partially and through surviving myths and records rather than through direct narrative. The development of the Pokémon Center as an institution, the standardization of the gym challenge system, the creation of the professor archetype, and the practice of giving starting Pokémon to new trainers, all of these are features of the contemporary Pokémon world that presumably emerged from somewhere and were established at some point in a history that the games have not shown. The Hisui games suggest a beginning, a time when the partnerships were newer and stranger, but the long middle of that history, the centuries of development that produced the recognizable Pokémon world of the main series, is a gap that the games have described around without filling in. The Pokémon known as Mimikyu is perhaps the most poignant of the series' mysteries, in the sense that its entire characterization is built around something the game does not show. Mimikyu wears a disguise fashioned after Pikachu, and it does so because it wants to be loved the way Pikachu is loved. The entries describe its true form as something so frightening that a researcher who glimpsed it briefly suffered significant harm. The game does not show the true form, and Mimikyu is characterized as desperately protective of its disguise, unwilling to let anyone see what is beneath it. The mystery of Mimikyu is therefore a mystery about concealment rather than revelation, about a creature that has built its entire public existence around the management of something it cannot share. What is beneath the disguise? The game will not say. The question is part of Mimikyu's character in a way that makes answering it beside the point. What matters, as the game's characterization of Mimikyu makes clear, is not what the true form looks like, but what the disguise represents. A creature that wants to be loved has made itself unlovable in its true form, or believes it has, and has constructed an alternative appearance from cloth and imagination and hope. The tragedy is not the secret. The tragedy is the effort and the longing, and those the game makes fully visible, even while it keeps the form itself hidden. There are small things in the Pokemon world that the games treat as perfectly ordinary, but that become strange when examined carefully. The relationship between a Pokemon's level and its physical development is one of the more openly unexplained aspects of the series. A Pokemon grows stronger as it gains experience points in battle, reflected mechanically in its level increasing and its stats improving. But the biological correlate of that growth is never described. Does leveling up involve physical changes to the Pokemon's body? Do the stats that improve correspond to measurable physical attributes, or are they abstractions that have no direct biological equivalent? The game uses numbers to represent growth without ever connecting those numbers to anything that a biologist in the Pokemon world could observe and document. The mystery of how Pokemon know moves is similarly unexamined. A Pokemon can learn a move it has never used before by reaching a certain level, or by being exposed to a technical machine, or by being taught by an NPC character. The game treats all three of these as equivalent methods of acquiring a skill, but the biological mechanism they imply is radically different for each. Reaching a level implies that growth alone, independent of practice, is sufficient to acquire a complex physical skill. A technical machine implies that a piece of recorded data can be directly transferred into a Pokemon's behavioral repertoire without repetition or practice. And being taught by an NPC implies that a short interaction with a human is sufficient to encode a new physical capability permanently. None of these mechanisms is described, and the game does not distinguish between them in terms of their implications. The world continues past the edges of every game in every direction, full of questions that have never been posed and mysteries that have never been named. The Pokemon that live on routes the player never visits. The histories of trainers whose stories began before the game started and will continue after it ends. The events that shaped the regions in the games that have not yet been made, in the parts of the world that the map has not yet reached. All of that exists in the sense that it could exist, in the sense that the world is large enough to contain it. And somewhere in that possibility, in the space between what the games have shown and what they might someday show, the mysteries wait. Patient as Zezjatu watching the sun, quiet as Missingno assembling itself from garbage data at the edge of the sea, present as the truck by the dock that everyone noticed and no one could explain, as sitting there in the pixelated sunlight of Vermilion City, detailed enough to matter, silent enough to remain forever uncertain. That is where the Pokemon world keeps its most enduring secrets. Not in the legendary encounters or the main story beats, but in the small and specific details that the games chose to include without explaining, the details that accumulate across decades into something that feels very much like the texture of a real and unsolved world. The Pokémon known as Gardevoir is described across multiple entries as a creature that will give its own life to protect the trainer it has bonded with. The entries are specific about this, noting that Gardevoir creates a small black hole to protect those it cares for, and that it will put all of its psychic energy into that creation regardless of the cost to itself. The devotion described in those entries is absolute, framed not as programming or instinct, but as a genuine emotional commitment that transcends self-preservation. What has never been addressed in any game is what happens to that commitment when a trainer releases Gardevoir, or when a trainer is no longer alive, or when the bond between trainer and Pokémon is broken under circumstances that are less clean than a simple parting. The entries describe what Gardevoir will do for a trainer it loves. They do not describe what Gardevoir experiences when the relationship that defines its emotional life is taken away. The question of attachment and its consequences runs through many Pokémon designs without ever being resolved into a coherent framework. Arcanine is described in entries as a Pokémon that runs faithfully beside a trainer it has bonded with, never stopping, never resting, covering enormous distances in a single day. The legendary quality attributed to Arcanine in its entries frames this dedication as awe-inspiring, the kind of loyalty that inspired the myths of ancient peoples. But the flip side of that dedication, what Arcanine experiences in the absence of the trainer it has chosen to run beside, is something that entries do not address. The faithfulness described in those texts is total. It carries no acknowledgement of what the creature needs in return, or whether it needs anything, or whether the asymmetry of the relationship that entries describe is something the game considers at all. There is a Pokémon introduced in the second generation called Smeargle, whose ability, Sketch, allows it to permanently copy any move it witnesses another Pokémon use. The mechanical implication of this ability is that Smeargle can theoretically learn the moves of any Pokémon in the entire game, creating a creature with no fixed move pool and no biological specialization of its own. The entries describe Smeargle as a painter, a creature that marks its territory with a fluid secreted from its tail, using colors that shift based on its mood and health. The connection between the painting behavior and the sketch ability is implied in the design, but never explained in the fiction. What does it mean for a creature to be defined by its ability to copy? Is the Smeargle who has sketched a water type move the same Smeargle as the one who has sketched a fire type move? The game treats both as identical, since Smeargle's core identity is its ability to copy rather than any specific copied content. But the philosophical question of identity and copying, raised gently by Smeargle's design, has never been engaged with directly in any game's narrative. The Pokémon known as Shedinja is one of the most openly mysterious species in the series in terms of the process by which it comes to exist. When Nincada evolves into Ninjask, the exoskeleton that Nincada sheds during the transformation becomes a separate Pokémon, Shedinja, which appears in an empty slot in the player's party, if one is available. The game treats this as a mechanic, without explaining what it is. The entries describe Shedinja as a Pokémon whose body does not move, that does not breathe, and that is said to steal the souls of those who peer into the crack in its back. The split from Ninjask is not described in biological terms. It is simply a fact of the evolution, something that happens without being accounted for within the fiction of the world. What is Shedinja in terms of what it is made of and whether it has consciousness? The entries imply something like a haunting rather than a life, a presence without biology. But whether that presence experiences anything, whether the hollow shell has an interior that corresponds to anything in the Pokémon world's understanding of spirit or consciousness, has never been addressed. The legendary Pokemon Jirachi is described as sleeping for 1,000 years at a time, waking only briefly to grant wishes before returning to sleep. The entries do not address where Jirachi is during those 1,000 years of sleep, physically or spiritually, or what the experience of 1,000 year sleep feels like from the inside. The contrast between the length of its dormancy and the brevity of its waking period raises a question about what constitutes a life for a creature operating on that timescale. A human who lives 70 years and a Jirachi who wakes for 7 days every 1,000 years occupy completely different relationships to time, and the game does not attempt to bridge that difference or to address what Jirachi's perspective on its own existence might be. It simply wakes, grants wishes, and sleeps again, and the game accepts that without examination. The water roots of Hoenn are populated with a density of aquatic Pokémon that implies an ecosystem of significant complexity, and the diving mechanic introduced in those games allows players to descend to the seafloor and navigate underwater areas filled with their own distinct species. The ecosystem visible underwater is different from the one visible at the surface, populated by different Pokémon with different behaviors, and the entries for many of those deep-water species describe lives spent in environments that human beings rarely access. But the full ecology of those underwater spaces, the food chains that sustain the large predatory species, the relationships between the Pokémon visible to the player and the ones the game implies exist in even greater depths beyond what can be explored, has never been mapped or described. The ocean in the Pokémon world is presented as a space with boundaries that the player can reach, but the entries for many of the creatures living there suggest a world that extends much deeper than the diving mechanic allows. There is a legend in the Pokémon world, referenced in the entries for certain Johto species, of a great tree that once stood at the center of the forest. The entries describe Pokémon gathering around this tree and speak of something that was lost when the tree was no longer there. The entries for the Pokémon associated with this legend do not describe what caused the tree to disappear or what the consequences of its loss were felt to be by the creatures who had gathered around it. The legend is referenced across multiple entries without being drawn into a coherent narrative, appearing as a piece of background mythology that shaped certain Pokemon's relationship to forests and ancient places without being given the context that would let a player understand its full scope. Whether the tree in the legend was a specific location that appears in any game, or whether it is purely mythological within the fiction, is a question the games have never answered. The relationship between Pokemon evolution and age is one of the more quietly strange aspects of the series. Most Pokemon evolve based on experience accumulated through battle, level, or specific conditions, and the entries do not describe evolution as correlated with biological age. A Pokemon that never battles could theoretically remain in its basic form indefinitely, while a Pokemon that battles frequently might evolve very quickly. The entries for some species describe evolutionary forms that appear very old, covered in armor, or possessing characteristics associated with ancient creatures, without those forms being connected to actual age. A player who raises a Pokemon from level 1 and trains it to its final form in the course of a week has not waited for the creature to age into its mature form. They have produced the mature form through a process that is distinct from biological growth in every way that matters. The game presents this as unremarkable. The fiction of the world treats it as normal. But the underlying mechanism by which a creature becomes something dramatically different from what it was, in a way that is not tied to the passage of time, is never explained. The Pokemon known as Kadabra carries an unusual piece of lore in its entries that has attracted attention for decades. The entries describe a boy who one day woke up to find that he had transformed into a Kadabra overnight. The entry does not explain the circumstances of the transformation, why it occurred, who the boy was, or what became of him after the transformation. It presents the event as historical, something that happened once, and that is considered significant enough to be included in the official record of the species. The implication that human beings can transform into Pokémon under certain circumstances, or that the line between humans and Pokémon is not as fixed as the general presentation of the world would suggest, is not developed anywhere in the games. It sits in the entry for Kadabra as a single strange data point, unrepeated and unexplained. The broader question of what distinguishes humans from Pokémon in the world of these games is one that has been raised in various forms across the series without being settled. The games feature humans who have strong psychic abilities, humans who can communicate with Pokémon directly, and humans who seem to possess qualities that would be described as supernatural in the ordinary context of the world. The entries for certain Pokémon describe species that were once human or that contain the spirits of humans. The boundary between the categories is porous in ways that the games acknowledge in specific cases without addressing as a general matter. Whether there is a principled distinction between humans and Pokémon in the biology of that world, or whether the distinction is social and conventional rather than fundamental, has never been stated explicitly. The Pokémon Lugia appears in the second generation of games in a condition of self-imposed isolation, living alone at the bottom of the ocean rather than in the sky where its design and its mythology would suggest it belongs. The entries describe this isolation as deliberate, driven by Lugia's awareness that its own power is destructive when unleashed, that a creature with its strength must be careful about where it chooses to exist and what it chooses to do. The entries note that Lugia's wings can create storms simply by being flapped, and that it chooses not to flap them unless absolutely necessary. The picture that emerges from those entries is of a creature living under significant self-restraint, choosing isolation, not because it prefers solitude, but because it believes that solitude is what the world needs from it. The game does not explore how Lugia arrived at that belief, how long it has been living in self-imposed exile, or what it does in those deep water depths during the long years between the events the game depicts. There is a detail in the original Gold and Silver games that researchers noted soon after the games released, and that has never been fully explained. The radio system in those games plays different content depending on the location of the player and the time of day, and certain stations could only be received in specific parts of the world. One station broadcasts what the game describes as mysterious signals at certain hours, signals that produce effects in the game when played at specific moments. The mystery surrounding those signals has to do with what produced them. The game implies, without confirming, that the signals come from something outside the ordinary world, something connected to the legends of Johto in ways that are felt rather than stated. Players who experimented with the radio discovered effects that seemed inconsistent with how the system was described, responses from the game that suggested the signals were doing something that the official explanation of the mechanic did not account for. Whether those effects were designed or accidental, and whether the signal source is something that the designers had a specific answer for internally, has never been addressed in any public statement. The Pokémon known as Slowking exists in a state that is described in its entries as one of extraordinary insight. The shelled or venom that flows through its system after the bite on its head is credited with dramatically enhancing its cognitive capacity to a degree that the entries suggest puts Slowking well beyond ordinary Pokémon intelligence. The entries note that it researches and thinks, that it ponders problems of great complexity, and that its understanding of the world deepens the longer it remains in that state. But the entries also note that if the shelter were to detach, all of that enhanced understanding would be lost. The mystery is what those insights consist of and whether they are communicated to anyone. If Slowking has a level of understanding that exceeds ordinary Pokemon, what does it understand? The entries describe the capacity for understanding without describing its content, leaving the nature of Slowking's exceptional wisdom as something suggested by the design without being substantiated by any detail. The presence of ruins in every region of the Pokemon world, all of them connected to legends of ancient Pokemon or ancient civilizations, suggests a history that stretches back far beyond what the games have ever shown directly. Some of these ruins are specifically dated within the fiction, described as being thousands of years old. Others are simply ancient, predating recorded history. The diversity of those ruins, each one reflecting a different culture's relationship to the Pokemon of their region, implies that the Pokemon world has a global history of coexistence between humans and creatures that the games have only ever shown in fragments. The ruins of Alph in Johto, the sealed chambers of the Regigroup in Hoenn, the ancient temples of Sinnoh, the stone formations of Crown Tundra in Galar, each of these connects to a distinct chapter of a global history that has never been assembled into a coherent account. The overall shape of that history, who these ancient peoples were, and how their relationships with Pokemon compared to the relationships depicted in contemporary games, is one of the deepest mysteries the series has created and one of the ones it has most consistently declined to resolve. The Pokemon known as Volcarona is described in its entries as a creature that became the sun for Pokemon during an ancient winter that blocked the light. The entries do not describe this event as mythological. They present it as historical fact, something that occurred in a specific era when the world was cold and dark, and a creature's fire substituted for the warmth of the sun itself. The scale of what that claim implies is extraordinary. A single creature's light warming an entire ecosystem during a period of extended darkness would require a level of energy output that the game does not attempt to reconcile with Volcarona's otherwise ordinary biological presentation. It is a Pokemon that can be caught on a route, that has stats and a move pool and a level. The gap between the mythological history described in its entry and the practical reality of catching one in a dusty ruin is one that the game accepts without comment. There is a Pokemon introduced in the 5th generation called Golurk that is described as a giant clay automaton created by an ancient civilization to protect people and Pokemon. The entries note that it flies despite having no obvious wings, that it was sealed with bolts to prevent its power from running out of control, and that the power source inside it is a mystery even to contemporary researchers in the game's world. The ancient civilization that created Golurk is not named in the entries. It is not connected to any specific location or to any other ruins that the player visits. Golurk simply exists as the product of a civilization that apparently had the knowledge and capability to create a giant autonomous being powered by an unknown energy source, and that civilization is then never mentioned again in any context that gives it shape or meaning. The mystery of who created Golurk is entirely open, and the game seems to prefer it that way. The Pokemon known as Sigilyph is described as a creature that retains memories of an ancient civilization as the only witness to its destruction. The entries do not specify which civilization or when it was destroyed, or what Sigilyph saw during the destruction it witnessed. They note that it continues to patrol the routes the civilization once used, flying the same paths over and over, as though the city it once protected still exists. The image that description creates is melancholy in a way that is unusual for the series, a creature perpetually performing a task whose purpose has been gone for an unknown number of centuries, navigating paths that no longer lead anywhere because the place they led to no longer exists. Whether Sigilif is aware of the civilization's absence, or whether it simply continues its patrol because its programming or instinct demands it regardless of context, is something the entries leave open. The question of Pokemon memory and whether it persists across evolution is raised by certain designs that without ever being directly answered. When a Caterpie evolves into a Metapod and then into a Butterfree, is the creature that emerges from the cocoon the same creature that entered it in terms of memory and personality? The game treats evolutionary continuity as assumed, allowing the same Pokemon to be tracked through its evolutionary stages without suggesting any discontinuity in identity. But the biology implied by certain evolutions, particularly the ones that involve a dormant cocoon stage, suggests a transformation profound enough that continuity of memory would not be biologically obvious. The entries for Metapod describe it as motionless, inside a hardened shell, conserving energy, preparing for transformation. They do not describe what, if anything, is happening to the mind of the creature during that process, or whether the Butterfree that emerges has any access to the memories of the Caterpie that preceded it. The Sinjo Ruins, a location that appears in the Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver games, connects the mythology of Johto to the mythology of Sinnoh in ways that have never been fully elaborated. The location is accessible through a specific event that requires a Pokemon obtained through a limited distribution, and reaching it triggers a special story sequence involving the legendary Pokemon of Sinnoh appearing in the Johto region. The connection between the two regions implied by this shared location and the history of the people who built the ruins at a place where the two regions apparently meet is not developed beyond what the event sequence shows. Who were the people who built that location? Why did they choose a place that felt like a convergence point between two distinct regional mythologies? The ruins exist as a meeting point without anyone explaining what it meant that the two traditions met there. The Pokemon known as Gallade is the result of an evolution that branches from the line containing Gardevoir, produced when a male Kirlia evolves using a specific stone. The entries for Gallade describe it as a chivalric figure, a knight-like creature devoted to protecting others. The parallel between Gallade's chivalric devotion and Gardevoir's absolute loyalty to its trainer is notable, and the branching of the evolutionary line, where the same base creature can produce two dramatically different outcomes based on gender and item, has implications for how the Pokemon world understands identity and development that the game has never explored. What does it mean for two creatures with the same origin to develop such different but equally absolute forms of devotion? The game presents this as a feature of the evolutionary line without treating the philosophical parallel as something worth examining. There is a small detail in the design of Pokemon Gold and Silver that has been discussed by researchers interested in the series' music and sound design. Certain locations in those games use music that was composed to reflect the time of day, with the tracks shifting as real-world time changed, and the game's internal clock tracked the passage of hours. The composers of those tracks, including Junichi Masuda and Go Ichinosu, have spoken in general terms about the intention behind the time-based music, describing a desire to make the world feel alive and responsive to the player's actual experience of time. But the specific choices made about which locations received which treatment, and what the composers believed the music was communicating at different hours are not documented in any complete form. The melancholy quality of certain nighttime tracks in those games, particularly in locations associated with legend and ancient history, feels deliberate in a way that has not been fully accounted for in any publicly available discussion of the design process. The Pokemon known as Gengar is described in certain entries as the Shadow of Clefable, a claim that is not mechanical in nature, but which the entries present as a kind of folk belief within the game's world. The idea that one Pokemon could be the shadow of another that the dark form of something kind and round could take on independent existence is the kind of mythological logic that feels deliberately incorporated into the design. But whether the shadow claim is meant to be taken literally within the fiction, and whether the relationship between Gengar and Clefable has any reality beyond the folk belief referenced in the entry, has never been confirmed. The visual and typing contrast between the two species is clear enough to support the idea that they were designed in relation to each other. The entries that describe one as the shadow of the other could be reflecting a deliberate design intention, or they could simply be recording a belief that exists within the world without endorsing it as fact. The concept of held items in the Pokémon battle system raises questions about the physical reality of the game's mechanics that are rarely examined. A Pokémon in battle can hold a single item that produces specific effects during the fight. The item might heal the Pokémon, boost a specific stat, or trigger an effect under certain conditions. The game treats the held item as a property of the Pokémon's inventory, assigned before battle and present throughout. But where is the item being held during a battle? If the item is a berry, is the Pokémon carrying it? If the item is a piece of metal or a jewel, how does holding it affect the Pokémon's performance in a way that the game's mechanics describe? The physical logistics of held items are entirely abstract within the game's presentation, and the fiction of the world has never attempted to ground them in any description of how a Pokémon actually interacts with what it is carrying. The Pokémon known as Flygon is described in its entries as the Desert Spirit, a creature whose wings produce a singing sound when it flies through arid environments. The entries note that the sound can be heard across great distances, and that people who live near the desert have long associated it with certain atmospheric phenomena. The mythology surrounding Flygon within the fiction of the Pokémon world is rich enough in these entries to suggest that the creature has been part of the cultural landscape of desert-living people for a very long time. But the specific myths, the stories that people tell about the singing sound and what it means, are never described beyond the most general references in the entries. The Desert Spirit of Flygon is a title that implies a body of lore without providing any of it, leaving the content of that lore as something the player must imagine rather than read. The relationship between the legendary Pokémon Cobalion, Terrakion, and Virichin in the Unova region is described in entries as a bond formed in response to a historical event involving human conflict that threatened both Pokémon and humans. The three are presented as a group who chose each other, who formed a pact in response to shared experience rather than being connected by creation or type. The entries describe them as having protected Pokémon from human violence during a specific war, hiding them in a forest until the conflict passed. The war itself is not named. The region where it occurred is implied to be Unova, but not specified. The aftermath of the conflict, including what happened to the human factions involved, and how the relationship between humans and Pokémon in that region recovered, is not described. The three legendary swords are defined by an event they lived through without the event itself being given enough context to understand its full scope. The Pokémon known as Genesect is described as having been resurrected from a fossil more than 300 million years old and then modified extensively by Team Plasma. The entries note that only the fossil was ancient, that everything about Genesect's current form has been altered from whatever the original creature was. The mystery this creates is about identity and continuity. Is Genesect the same creatures as the fossil that was found, or is it something new that was built using that fossil as raw material? The game's entries use language that treats Genesect as a specific individual, referring to it with a definite article and describing its experiences in the present tense. but the extent of the modification done to its body is described as total, leaving the relationship between the creature that was 300 million years old and the creature that exists now as something the game acknowledges is complicated without resolving what it means. There is a recurring character type in the Pokemon games, present in almost every generation, who stands at the entrance to a cave or a forest and tells the player that the area beyond is dangerous and that only experienced trainers should proceed. The character type is so consistent that it has become a kind of convention, recognized immediately by players who have played multiple games. But what these characters are, whether they are park rangers, volunteer guardians, representatives of an official body, or simply concerned citizens who have taken it upon themselves to warn travelers, has never been established. They appear without identification, deliver their warning, and remain at their post indefinitely. Whether any institutional structure exists behind their presence, or whether they are simply individuals acting alone in a role that many different people have independently decided to fill, is a question the games have never posed and therefore never answered. The regional Pokédex presents a curated selection of species for each area, implying that different Pokémon inhabit different regions in a distribution that reflects the ecology and history of those places. But the mechanism by which species are distributed across regions has never been fully explained. Some species appear in nearly every region and can be found in every game. Others are endemic to single areas and are described in entries as native to specific environments. But the biogeographical history of the Pokemon world, the account of how species spread across continents and evolved in isolation to produce the regional variations observed in certain games, is something the games gesture toward without providing. The regional forms introduced in Sun and Moon, where familiar species have developed distinct appearances and typings specific to the Alola region, imply a process of geographic isolation and evolution that the entries describe in general terms without grounding in any account of when that isolation began or how long it has been operating. The Pokemon known as Delmise is described as the spirit of seaweed that has gathered around an anchor, animating the accumulated mass and acting through it. The entries describe it as drifting through deep water and preying on passing Pokemon by drawing them in with the anchor. The mystery of Delmise is about what the spirit is and where it came from. The entries do not describe the death or loss of anything that might have left a spirit behind. The seaweed spirit is simply present, inhabiting its anchor without a history that explains its origin. Whether the spirit existed before the anchor, using the first anchor it encountered as a vehicle for itself, or whether the spirit is something that emerged from the particular combination of accumulated organic material and metal, is not addressed. The entries present the creature without explaining what it fundamentally is. There is a piece of lore associated with the seafloor cavern in Huen that describes the location as a place where the legendary sleeping creature was sealed long ago by a Pokemon of weather and sky. The sealing is presented as historical fact within the game, something that happened in an era before the contemporary setting. But the entries and dialogue that describe this event do not address what the relationship between the sealing Pokemon and the sealed one looked like, how long the sealing took to accomplish, or whether the sleeping creature was aware of what was being done to it. The seal that was placed on it has held for an unspecified but clearly very long time, and the events of the game involve that seal being broken. But the original act of sealing, the process by which one legendary creature imprisoned another, is described in terms of outcome rather than process, as something that occurred without any account of what it cost either of the participants. The Pokemon known as Duskull is described in entries as wandering through the night seeking misbehaving children. which the entries frame with an earnestness that makes the detail more disturbing than playful. The choice of children as the specific focus of Duskull's attention, and the implication that misbehavior is the criterion by which it selects its targets, connects Duskull to a tradition of folkloric figures that existed to enforce social norms through fear. The entries do not describe what Duskull does when it finds the children it has been seeking. They simply note that it seeks them, leaving the consequence entirely to the imagination of the reader. Whether this was a deliberate choice to create unease without explicit darkness, or whether the entries were simply cut short before describing the full folklore, is not something that has been addressed by the designers. The mystery of what happens to a Pokemon world between the games has always been implied by the passage of time the games acknowledge. Gold and Silver are set several years after Red and Blue. Black and White are set in a period contemporary to the Kanto and Hoenn games, but distant from them geographically. The relationships between these timelines, including questions about which events are understood to have occurred in the past and which are happening simultaneously in different parts of the world, have been addressed in partial ways by official statements and by the games themselves. But the everyday life of the Pokemon world, in the years not shown by any game, the ordinary events that occurred on routes and in cities while no protagonist was present to observe them, is a category of history that will never be filled in. Those years exist as blank space in the timeline, and the creatures and people who inhabited them had stories that the game will never tell. The Pokemon known as Eevee is perhaps the most discussed design in the series in terms of its evolutionary implications. Eevee can evolve into 8 different final forms, each corresponding to a different type, and the conditions required for each evolution are varied. Some require items, some require friendship, some require specific times of day, some require specific locations. The entries describe Eevee as having an unstable genetic structure that allows it to adapt to almost any environment, producing dramatically different creatures in response to different conditions. But the 8 evolutions that exist in the games are not described as the limit of what Eevee can become. The entries have occasionally used language that suggests more potential forms exist, that Eevee's adaptive capacity extends beyond what has been documented. Whether additional evolutions exist within the fiction of the world, waiting to be discovered in the right conditions, or whether the entries are simply using generalized language about Eevee's adaptive potential without implying specific undocumented forms, has been a point of discussion for decades without a definitive answer. The pattern of numbers in the Pokemon world is something that appears frequently enough in the lore to feel intentional, but infrequently enough to resist systematic interpretation. The number 108 appears in the context of Spiritom's spirit count and the odd keystone ritual. The number 3 recurs in legendary groupings across nearly every region. The number 7 is referenced in certain Hoenn legends. Whether these numbers reflect a deliberate mythological framework embedded in the series' design, a set of numerological associations that the designers incorporated consistently, or whether they are independent coincidences that the community has recognized as a pattern, is not something that has ever been addressed by anyone with knowledge of the design process. The numbers feel significant enough to notice and distributed widely enough that their presence across different games could not be entirely accidental. But the full account of what they mean, if they mean anything systematically, is not available. The Pokemon world's handling of the passage of seasons in certain games, where different Pokemon appear, different areas become accessible, and certain story events only occur during specific times of year, introduced a dimension of the world's physicality that earlier games had not represented. The seasons in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum were absent, but Black and White introduced a monthly cycle. The entries for certain species note behaviors that are season-specific, migratory patterns, or hibernation periods that reflect real ecological responses to changing conditions. But the seasonal framework introduced in Black and White was not maintained in subsequent games, and the Pokémon whose entries described seasonal behaviors did not carry those behaviors forward into the post-seasonal games. The ecological detail suggested by the seasonal system was developed just far enough to become interesting and then discontinued, leaving the seasonal entries as records of a dimension of the world that the games briefly rendered and then chose not to continue rendering. There is a Pokémon called Hoopa, whose power is described in its entries as the ability to bend dimensions, to open rings that connect distant spaces, and to summon other Pokémon or objects through those rings. The entries describe Hoopa in its smaller contained form as mischievous and fond of collecting things, pulling shiny objects from far away as a form of play. Its larger, unbound form is described as a creature capable of pulling entire buildings and mountains through its rings, a being of almost incomprehensible spatial power. The containment of that power in the smaller form, described in the game's lore as the result of a specific vessel created to suppress Hoopa's abilities, raises questions about what Hoopa experienced during the centuries it was contained, and whether the personality described in its smaller form, the mischievous collector, is authentic to the creature or a product of the suppression. What is Hoopa without the vessel? The larger form suggests something, but the entries for the larger form describe behavior without describing interiority. The Pokémon known as Eternatus, introduced in Sword and Shield, is described as having arrived on Earth in a meteor 50,000 years ago and having been dormant since then in the depths beneath the Galar region. The entries note that the energy it releases from its core is the source of the Dynamax phenomenon that defines the gameplay mechanics of that generation. The implication that an alien creature lying dormant beneath a region for 50,000 years is responsible for one of the game's central mechanics connects the world's history to its mechanics in a way that the series has not often attempted. But the origin of Eternatus, where it came from before it arrived in the meteor, what it was doing for 50,000 years of dormancy, and whether it arrived alone or is connected to something larger beyond the ordinary world, are all questions that the game raises through its lore and does not answer. The Pokémon world contains characters who have lived long enough to witness multiple eras of its history, legendary trainers whose careers span decades, and whose knowledge of the world reflects experiences that the player character is just beginning. The elder figures in each region, the gym leaders who have held their positions for many years, the Pokémon professors who have spent their careers in research, all of them carry histories that the games reference without fully telling. What happened in those years? What did the elder gym leaders of Kanto see during the period when Team Rocket was building its power? What did the researchers discover during the long years of study that preceded the events of any individual game? The people of the Pokémon world have inner lives and histories that the games acknowledge without exploring, and those histories contain stories that will never be told in any official form. The sense that remains, after all of these questions have been posed and set aside, is that the Pokémon world is genuinely larger than the games that contain it. Not in the way that any fictional world is technically larger than any specific story set within it, but in the more specific sense that the games were designed with awareness of that larger world and made deliberate choices to leave most of it unseen. The mysteries are not accidental. They are the architecture of a world that takes its own depth seriously, that chose long ago to be the kind of place where questions accumulate rather than resolve, where every answer opens into two more unanswered things, and where the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and unexplored is available at any moment to anyone who stops moving through the roots and roots long enough to look at what surrounds them. The questions that run through the Pokemon world are not problems waiting for solutions. They are the texture of the world itself, the evidence that someone imagined a place large enough and strange enough and old enough to contain things that even its inhabitants do not fully understand. The old man by the lake who describes something he cannot see, the burned mansion with its careful journals, the signal broadcast across Johto at certain hours, the abandoned power plant where a creature of lightning lives alone among silent machinery, the hollow shell that haunts the same roots as the creature it was shed from, the ancient automaton powered by a mystery its makers took with them. All of these are places where the world shows you something without explaining it, trusting you to feel the weight of what is not said. That trust is part of what makes these games feel the way they feel in the quiet hours. The weight of something unseen is present in the spaces between the facts, in the entries that describe behaviors without causes, in the legends that name things without locating them, in the characters who speak as though they know more than they are saying. It is present on routes that feel too long and too quiet to be merely geographical. It is present in the music that shifts when you enter a particular building and does not shift back the way you expect when you leave. It is present in the games that have been played and replayed and carried through childhood and into adulthood, and that still, sometimes, in the right light and the right moment, feel like they are keeping a secret. The Pokemon world keeps its secrets well. It has been keeping them for more than 25 years, and whatever answers eventually arrive in future games will not empty the store of them, because the world is designed to generate new mysteries even as old ones are resolved, to remain always the kind of place where a careful reader will find something that was not there before, something that raises a question the game has no intention of answering just yet. That quality is a gift that the series has given everyone who has ever traveled through it. The world does not end when the credits roll. The questions do not stop when the game is saved. They continue in the background, patient and quiet, in the same place they have always been, in the margins of the Pokédex, in the code beneath the roots, in the silence that follows the last note of a track that has been playing in the same ancient ruin for more than 2 decades without anyone knowing exactly why it was written to sound exactly like that. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you again.